Hello and welcome to the Cuyamungue Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, and on behalf of our Board of Directors, our advisors, volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamungue Institute is an independent nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience, following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And as an educational institution, we take an open approach and we invite scholars in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration, and that's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. And on these weekly Sunday discussions, we've had a full spectrum of topics from neuroscience and anthropology, archaeology, astronomy, philosophy, mythology, shamanism, rituals, the hero's journey, the root of theater, prehistory. It goes on, from the arts to the sciences and everything in between. And you're welcome to visit our website at CuyamungueInstitute.com. All of our presentations are free. And of course, as a nonprofit, we want to invite you to become a supporting member. And we thank you, the community members who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamungue Institute. Today's discussion is at the very heart of everything that this institute represents. It's been the ongoing exploration documenting the experiences of altered states, trance states, expanded experiences of consciousness through the practice of holding different body positions, which is the original work of this institute. Our core mission at the Cuyamungue Institute is to introduce and support the research of trance states we believe were widely enjoyed by our early indigenous ancestors worldwide. We see this as a tradition lost through the millennia on our march to our modern day, and it was the daring and insightful work of anthropologist Felicitas D. Goodman who revived this practice. She looked at some of the oldest, most authentic records we have, the world's collection of early and indigenous art, and decoded selected artifacts as ritual instructions. The idea that only mystics can achieve mystical states, well, early societies, traditional societies tell us that everyone had equal access, and those that could not, they were the exception, not the norm. Yeah. We can no longer see these experiences as some kind of odd or alternative, but rather a natural experience and a natural extension of the human experience. It's time for us to embrace that full range of human life and travel this path of having a foot in both worlds and dissolve that boundary where it's the full spectrum of what human life has to offer.
Well, I appreciate our guest today. First of all, a husband-wife team. Yeah, we are a husband-wife team, so we support and appreciate other husband-wife teams. But Todd and Christine VanPool, both anthropologists at the University of Missouri and teach there, often publish together. And they both conducted extensive field work at 76 Draw, a Casa Grande settlement near Deming, New Mexico. And here they are working together and looking at this very thing, altered states of consciousness. So if you're studying shamanic cultures in any way, you are looking at altered states of consciousness. And I think they're pushing where Felicitas Goodman left off and gave us a really firm and substantial body of work. They're pushing it even further. And we've been working with Todd and Christine for the past 3 years and collaborating on a few projects. And Todd is here today to share the presentation that he's put together, combining their work and ritual body postures and this work, and that he's been showing to select anthropological groups and saying, there's some cross correlation here that is worth looking at. And Todd's work has been in cognitive archaeology. He's looked at, from their work with Casa Grandes, they were led to cross-cultural comparisons of the symbolism of shamanic practices among other cultures, in particular Mesoamerican, Southwestern, Southeastern cultures, as well as the structure of underlying shamanic universes, and looking at how the experience of altered states expands into one's worldviews, how it's looked at cosmologically, where you find it in symbolism, in art. And so much of anthropological look at altered states has to do with the entheogens, tobacco, peyote, ayahuasca, datura. Those have been used throughout time and around the world to produce these altered states. But those entheogens have long been studied, right? Thoroughly studied. Much less effort has been on trance-based systems that don't use the entheogens that really call up your own inner pharmacopoeia, like this work does. That says, here it is embedded within, and there are ritual ways of jump-starting this to make a shift in the physiology to support these states. And so we have been collaborating with them on this work. Every time that we do a Zoom session, we say, hey, you know that we are recording your experiences. We are taking notes. We're actually recording our Zoom sessions where we all share, and this data will be shared with researchers, and these are among them. And so how sound induction, how ritual body posture, how the ritual itself, what is it doing? The value of flourishing, the range of the benefits, how body posture, social setting, and other factors influence our experiences themselves, and then what they mean. How do they compare to the shamanic cultures of old? How do they compare to what records we have in the ethnographies and in archaeology to the altered states of previous cultures, previous generations? They're here to discuss that today. They have a slideshow, and we want to say welcome.
There they are.
Okay, you've worked together for decades. Why shamanic cultures? Why altered states of consciousness? Why do we see this as the underpinning for cosmological structures? What is your personal quest? Christine has been with us in many, many interviews and talks, and so we have heard her quest. Todd, you're the star of this show. What is your quest? Just put it into context for us why this has been so intriguing to you personally.
Sure. So religion as a basic structure is universal to all humans. Every human group has a concept of religion. Now, not everybody in each human group believes in religion or uses religion, but every human group has a concept of religion, has a concept of the supernatural, has a concept of a spirit world. That's ubiquitous amongst all human cultures. There's some form of concept that at least some people believe in or act in accordance with. I, as an anthropologist, am very interested in human behavior, and there are certain things that every culture has, and understanding those things are central to trying to understand human behavior cross-culturally around the world. Gender, for example, is something I'm interested in. Every culture has a concept of gender. Every culture differentiates among gender categories of various sorts. Warfare is another thing that I'm interested in. Every culture has a concept of warfare. Every culture engages in warfare at some level, at least sometimes. By the same token, every culture has the concept of religion. So these things have attracted my attention because I think they're essential to trying to understand human behavior. As an anthropologist, if I get a hold of those things and I can understand those within a culture, I can learn a lot about that culture and about the behavior of individuals. So the reason why I'm interested in religion is in large part simply because it matters so much. It's so essential to human culture, to human behavior and human identity. Now, as part of that, I care about gender and I care about religion. Or I'm sorry, I care about gender and I care about warfare. I've published on those topics extensively. But religion was actually my first sort of love, if you will. I grew up in a religious household. I am religious myself. And I majored in religion as an undergraduate. And so this has been a long-standing academic interest of mine, looking at world religions, comparative religions, and trying to understand the relationship between religion, culture, and the structure of human behavior was probably the thing that brought me to anthropology to begin with. Mm-hmm. So when we look cross-culturally, probably the single most common form of religious expression cross-culturally is a form of animism. This idea that there are these spirits that are present within the world that we can interact with, that influence us and that we can influence. For example, ancestral spirits, every culture has some concept of ancestors in some way that continue to influence humans long after they're dead. That again is ubiquitous and it's present and manifested in various ways across cultures. when we look at these different sorts of religious systems, altered states of consciousness, this idea that there is some sort of a spirit world or a hidden world behind the world that we see here, there's a reality that's greater than just the physical reality, is extremely common. I don't know if I go so far as to say it's universal, but it's extremely common. So common, in fact, that most religions have some form of an altered state of consciousness. In a religion like Christianity, it may not be particularly important to many denominations of Christianity, but we have, for example, Pentecostals who will go into altered states of consciousness, speak in tongues, and prophesy. These other sorts of, I'm sorry?
Goodman's work.
Yeah, Felicitas Goodman did a lot of work with the Pentecostals.
Mhm.
Even in a religion like Christianity, where altered states of consciousness may not be central to what many people do, it's still very important to at least certain groups of Christians. And when we look cross-culturally, altered states of consciousness are frequently absolutely essential to religious expression in many cultures. So what I really like about Goodman's work, and the reason why I'm working with you all, the reason why I'm working with Chris, who brought me to you all, is because Goodman found a way to look specifically at a part of the altered state of consciousness experience that other people have largely ignored. And so I'm trying to build on that. And the research that we're doing here builds specifically on what Goodman was doing, what you all have been doing as part of the Cuyamungue Institute. As the leaders of this research, you all have put together some really worthwhile analyses that I think we can build from and use to understand humans in general, human behavior specifically. Now, you had mentioned cognitive archaeology, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in our
That was my
presentation.
next question.
Yeah.
Could you define it for us, and then why
Absolutely.
that? Yeah, why those tools? Yeah.
You bet. So cognitive archaeology is just simply, and there are lots of different names for this in different disciplines. And so you can talk about evolutionary psychology, and a whole variety of different names have been used by different folk. But cognitive archaeology is basically the idea that humans are human. And so I behave in certain ways, in part because I have a human mind, I have a human body that structures my behavior. And my dog, which shares substantial similarities with me in terms of my environment, and even down to what we eat and what we see on TV. My dog behaves differently than me because my dog is a dog and I'm a human. My dog has a dog brain and I have a human brain. And that structures my behavior. I have a human brain, I have a human body. And so I share more similarities with you all in terms of my behavior than I do my dog, because we're humans. Cognitive archaeology builds on that realization and says that human bodies, human minds, human neurological systems, human hormonal systems, the entire structure that leads to human behavior reflects an evolutionary past. And there are certain similarities and differences amongst individuals, but we can use this framework to try to understand how humans approach the world and use that to map the sorts of behavioral responses humans have. So this isn't a predictive sort of thing where it says, if you put a human in a maze of this sort, the human will always behave in such and such a way. Instead, what it says is that if you give humans problems, there are going to be certain sorts of ways that they might approach those problems. And we can see some similarities because they're humans. And we can use that to understand why humans behave in certain ways and why they don't behave in other ways. In this context, we can think about it this way. If I expose a typical human, a neurologically typical human, to certain things, let's say I gave them I gave them some LSD. The humans will respond consistently to that LSD. Now, there's going to be variation amongst people. There might be somebody who, for whatever reason, their physiology or their neurology is going to have a stronger response than somebody else. There might be somebody who has, say, some form of brain injury that might actually prevent them from responding to LSD as a neurologically typical human would. But we understand that if you expose humans to LSD, there's going to be some sort of a response, a neurological and physiological response that will have similarities amongst humans. And that's just simply because humans are humans. Cognitive archaeology builds on those sorts of ideas, that sort of idea of a consistency amongst humans, to try to look at why human behavior is similar in many regards, but also why it differs and what variables might be creating differences and what variables might be creating similarities. So in this particular analysis, we're looking at human cognition and the way that similarities in behavior produce similar responses to our body, and that in turn produces similarities in altered states of consciousness. So it basically is simply the idea, and it's a rather straightforward idea, that humans are humans and they behave like humans. And if we can understand how humans behave, that can give us insight into the archaeological record.
But also human potential and how to optimize our time here is a worthy quest. And I can see the connection of interest if we have a physiology and a neurology that can, in a normal, maybe it's not common, but a normal state, have these expanded experiences and the benefits therein of flourishing, of joy, of creativity. We can go on and on to the benefits. That is worthy of study. And to say that we have this capacity built in, it's part of our heritage, it's part of our birthright. And it's for all of us, not just mystics, not just monks, not just all of us. Those are very important considerations to add to human potential, right, to add to the human story, to add to the human identity and where we're going. Right?
I
That is
absolutely
key. Yeah.
agree with you, completely agree with you. I will say that this is one of the places where I find it so wonderful working with you, Laura, with you, Paul, also with Chris. You all are just sort of naturally born mystics. You've got a sense of the poetic in you. I tend to be far more limited in certain regards. I tend to be very economic and utilitarian in my analyses. And so I think it's great that you all have this concept of these sorts of flourishing and this mysticism, and I don't disagree with it at all. I tend to be heavily focused on things like political structures or social structures, the way that the tools and the way that people make their living merge into these more complex systems. And so I think it's great. And one of the things I really do enjoy about collaborating with you all is you expand my considerations beyond the very sort of utilitarian framework that I tend to use, just because that my mind is typically going to how do people stay alive, as opposed to how do people flourish. And not people do flourish. It's just I always tend to think about the very utilitarian aspects of all this.
Yeah, well, Maslow said the whole spectrum is important, right? So, but tell us about the slideshow. Do you have questions, comments?
No, go ahead.
Tell us about the slideshow and what your mission is with your presentation.
Sure. So
and
I'm
how
going to
it's
go
been
ahead
received. Go ahead. Yeah.
Share this with y'all. All right. So the work that we have here is work that we've been working on. So back during the pandemic, Christine made contact with Cuyamungue Institute, in particular with Laura.
Before actually the pandemic started, I'll have you know.
Very cool. So she made contact with Laura and Paul and just sort of started talking with them about the nature of altered states of consciousness, about Goodman's work. And Christine came across Goodman's work while she was doing some other research, found it very interesting. And when we made contact with CI as a result of that, I'm very late to the party. This is really the majority of the work has been with Christine Lee and Laura and Paul working together. And I'm just sort of, I am only now becoming kind of involved in this. And I think in large part because my specialty in statistical analysis and my specialty in terms of data analysis is finally able to contribute something meaningful to what you all are doing. So our focus here is on looking at the way and the interaction between transposture and other aspects of the medieval period culture. This is the result of work that Chris and I have been doing for, say, the last 30 years or thereabouts as professional archaeologists. But we're trying to work in some of the insights that CI, that Paul and Laura have created, trying to help us understand the archaeological record based upon that. In particular, we're trying to look at the relationship between posture, culture, and tobacco use, how that impacted the cosmology of these folks in the past. I list myself last here because in some ways, and this is fairly typical for me, I know the least about most of these topics that we're going to be talking about. I just happen to be the one who was kind of synthesizing this into a framework. But I'm going to ask Christine, Paul, and Laura to add in and to pipe up as we hit things that you all have something to say about and you know about. So I am the least of the authors here in many regards as we move forward. I certainly cannot take credit for all of this research.
Was that a Freudian slip of pipe in? Sorry.
Pipe in? Yes, indeed.
Chris, you need to speak up so we can all hear you. Yeah.
Oh, good. I was just asking if he had made a pun with pipe in because we're going to look at pipes in a bit.
So here's kind of where I'm hoping to go as part of this presentation. We're going to introduce posture as a significant component of trance experiences. This is, of course, CI's bread and butter. This is what Goodman's primary insight was in regards to the sort of work that the Cuyamungue Institute engages in. We're going to illustrate the interplay between medieval period entheogen use, in particular tobacco, the use of particular postures as part of ritual activity and the culture. Then we're going to explore the possibility that what we see here in the medieval period was in fact part of a more broadly spread ritual tradition associated with Mesoamerican cultures that probably was associated at some level with Mesoamerican style agriculture, which spread throughout North America 2,000 years ago on up to about 1,000 years ago is when it really became established in many areas. So kind of as a preceding sort of a statement here, with scientific analysis, we know that there are some things that we do know. We figure these things out, and these are our discoveries. We also know that there's some things that we don't know, and these are our questions. But there are times where we don't know things that we don't know. And what I mean here is that there are sometimes cases where there's something missing, a puzzle piece that's missing from our analyses that we don't even know it's missing. We don't know the right questions to ask to bring these things to the forefront so that we can say, oh, this is an important variable we need to consider. So science frequently grows because we're asking questions, we're trying to solve problems, or we're trying to find answers to questions we want to answer. But sometimes actually answering those questions requires us to think outside of the proverbial box and start tying into things that we didn't even think were relevant, but we suddenly realize, oh, the answer to this question is over here, and we didn't even know that this was significant to our particular question. So a lot of times our greatest contributions, our greatest scientific jumps are the result of recognizing that there's something we didn't realize was even important, and then working on those unacknowledged conditions to try to help us understand the world in a better way. What we're doing here, I think, is this third part here, where we're trying to deal with something that we didn't know was important, but now we know is important, trying to add that and shift a lot of the questions that we have from not knowing we didn't even know about it to asking some interesting questions about it now that we know that it's important. And in particular, postures is the focus here. So altered states of consciousness. An altered state of consciousness is actually a hard thing to define. We use it frequently in anthropology and in other disciplines, but it's not hard. It's not that easy to even define what a regular state of consciousness is, let alone an altered state of consciousness. What we do know is that humans behave in certain ways, and we can recognize when a human is behaving as we typically expect them to behave. We also know that there are times when humans perceive the world differently for a variety of reasons. In the paper that we have here, I liken this to being drunk. I don't really know necessarily what are all the hormonal and neurological characteristics that correspond to a standard state of consciousness, but I can typically recognize somebody who's drunk and differentiate that individual from somebody who's in a standard state of consciousness. Being drunk is an altered state of consciousness that's very typical within our culture. And entheogens, various things. People who don't get enough sleep will enter into altered states of consciousness. People who are in extreme pain may enter into altered states of consciousness. People who ingest certain sorts of psychedelics will enter into altered states of consciousness. We can typically, as a practical matter, recognize altered states of consciousness compared to a normal state of consciousness, but it's hard to define it neurologically, hormonally, physiologically, in a way that I can say, hey, an altered state of consciousness is defined as such and such. It's something that we tend to recognize as emergent result of behavior, as opposed to me being able to say, oh, hey, here's what's going on with the hormones, or here's what's going on neurologically. It just doesn't lend itself that clearly. But what we do know is that altered states of consciousness are human universals. Our minds, our bodies, in the right circumstances, will produce altered states of consciousness. You give me enough to drink, I'll be drunk. That's true for the typical person. That is a reliable structure, and humans have known this about altered states of consciousness. In fact, humans very much like altered states of consciousness most of the time, which is why alcohol is so common. Mind-altering drugs are so common. When my son was a little boy, 4 years old or thereabouts, he would just love to spin until he got dizzy and then just fall down. And my grandfather, or his grandfather, my father-in-law, commented that our son really liked being wigged out, that we're going to have to watch him when it comes time for drugs because he really likes that sort of stuff. And I was like, okay, fine, Fred. And I don't disagree with him. Not that our son has been very responsible with his choices, so I'm not trying to say anything about our son. But the point here is that even as a 4-year-old, our son liked being different, entering into altered state of consciousness, being dizzy, and engaging in that sort of play. And as a result, that is expected for humans. By the same token, a lot of 21-year-olds, when it's legal to drink, go out and they like drinking. We see that on the college campus all the time. Again, people like altered states of consciousness, and we will engage in them. Altered states of consciousness are universals. They take different forms, and in particular, trance is a common type of altered state of consciousness associated with religious experiences. Now, trance is only one type of altered state of consciousness. There can be lots of different altered states of consciousness of different sorts. I mentioned a drug-induced altered state of consciousness, either from alcohol or some other drug. There can also be things as intense as spirit possession, which is very common in some cultures. Fred Smith, for example, has done a lot of work with spirit possession in India and elsewhere, Nepal and India, and there's a lot of research that's looked at these sorts of altered states of consciousness, and that's different from the sort of trance-based altered states of consciousness that we're talking about here. But a lot of cultures use trance as a way of communicating with the spirit world. And the idea here is that while you're in an altered state of consciousness, while you're in trance, you can perceive aspects of a spirit world that are not typically reliably experienced by humans just living their lives, going around and doing whatever it is they normally do. Did you want to add something, Chris?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, cool.
Fred might.
Fred would be welcome to add something here if you wanted to.
Well, I will. There's also spontaneous mystical experiences that happen, I think, across the board too. Just
absolutely
uncalled, right? They just happen. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so altered states of consciousness is a very broad umbrella term that doesn't refer to any one thing. Instead, it's anything that isn't normal.
Catch-all term.
Which is very broadly defined, So in terms of known unknowns, things we know we don't know, we do have some basic ideas about the physiological structures for ASC, especially in terms of entheogens or drugs, synthetic drugs or entheogens, where people go and they take something and it affects their minds. We've spent a lot of time, a lot of money as researchers looking at these sorts of things. And so we've got some knowledge about the neurological impacts of some of these experiences. We don't understand them perfectly, for sure, but we've got some knowledge there. But we're still exploring cross-cultural variation in these sorts of experiences. In that, if I take, let's say, peyote, I take that, I know something about the physiological impact that's going to have on my neurology, on my physiology. I do have some knowledge of that, but the physiological impact that has on me in my particular social and cultural setting is going to be different from somebody who's, say, a part of the Native American church who might be taking peyote. And we don't really understand the cross-cultural variation in these sorts of experiences, even when we do understand the neurological and physiological impacts. And so there's even the little slice of the pie that we do understand, we don't understand it perfectly by any means. And so here's where cognitive anthropology comes in, cognitive archaeology that we were just talking about. The idea here is simply that our minds are human, the product of evolution developments. And as a result, we can start looking at how our minds interact with our environment, interact with our bodies, interact with all the things that go into us to affect our behavior, and start to understand how those things are interacting with each other and being expressed in our human behavior and in what we do, what we perceive, and how we communicate with each other. You want to add anything?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, so we're going to start off here with kind of a heuristic little model. This is simply a pie chart. The sizes of the slices do not matter at all. But this is a conceptual model that just simply says, hey, trance is going to be the result of a bunch of factors, a bunch of things that can go into and impact trance. And so one of those things that we know is important in many contexts cross-culturally in terms of trance experiences are entheogens. humans will use different sorts of aids, medicinal plants to initiate trance experiences and to allow them to interact with a spirit world. I mentioned peyote previously, which is a well-known one. Ayahuasca is also very common and well-known. There can be lots of different things. Those toads that people lick can even be a toad. We just saw...
The National Park System for Arizona just sent out a plea for people in Arizona not to lick the toads in national parks. Actually, that just hit the news.
Like that's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a thing.
I have to admit that it never occurred to me to grab toads and lick them, but obviously I don't have that right sort of cultural foundation that made that to seem reasonable.
Well, I guess toads can exude interesting substances on their skin because some cultures use it to tip their arrows with poison, right?
Oh,
So
that's true too.
they're interesting creatures.
Absolutely. But the point here is that entheogens is one of the things that affects trance. And not only is it that an entheogen can be used, but different entheogens have different impacts on the trance experience. So, for example, here on the left, you see peyote shamanism with the Huichol. The Huichol use peyote, they'll ingest the peyote, and then they will make these incredible artistic expressions talking about the experience that they had. This is typically they're done out of a yarn. They're these yarn tapestries. They're incredibly beautiful. And the Huichol talk about how their gods speak in color. And it's very interesting because the experiences are so intense that people talk about tasting color or hearing color, which is normally we think of color as something you see, but the senses will actually get crossed here.
Synesthesia.
Go ahead, Chris.
Synesthesia.
It's called synesthesia, where you will actually taste color.
Yep,
Or you will
firing of the senses.
down.
Yeah.
These sorts of things where the senses get kind of mixed. The peyote experience is so intense that they'll hear color, and it's this very vibrant world. The spirit world for the Huichol is this extremely brilliant, bright, vibrant world, in part because when they experience it using peyote, that's what they experience. And as a result, that gets built into the conception of the spirit world among the Huichol.
And their art.
And their art,
Yep.
absolutely. If you go over to the right side there, this is art, a shamanic art that's based on tobacco shamanism. This is among the Wuha, South American Native American group. Here you'll see lots of serpents. You'll see red and black symbolism. The tobacco actually is the exact opposite of the peyote in that the tobacco kills the color receptors in the eyes, makes the world very ghost-like. You'll see lots of ghostly figures in tobacco-based shamanic art. Lots of black and red, black and white sorts of images. We see this in the world where Chris and I work up in the Casas Grandes world, where the shamanic art there lacks a lot of color, certainly not the sort of peyote-based art that we see with the Huichol. Instead, it's very subdued, and lots of serpents, lots of water creatures that are part of that, and a real emphasis on soul flight, which seems to go along with tobacco. So the upshot here is it isn't just simply the presence of entheogens, it's the type of entheogen that seems to impact the trance experience that people have. And so if you're using peyote versus ayahuasca versus tobacco, those result in different sorts of experiences for the neurologically, the physiologically typical individual. And then that gets worked into the religious system as a result of the sort of perceptions you have of the spirit world based upon the entheogen. Now, not every culture uses entheogens. And so I talked about how the slice of the pie is heuristic. For a culture that does not use entheogens at all, for example, that rely on sleep deprivation or extend fasting to create these altered states of consciousness, entheogen won't even be a part of that pie. But for other cultures, it may be a significant part of the pie. This is to another part of the pie, culture. Every culture has a basic idea of what the spirit world is going to be like, of what the spirits that humans interact with are like. And as a result, people are, if you want to use this term, programmed to sort of perceive the world in certain ways, the spirit world in certain ways. And so when they say they ingest an entheogen, they anticipate the sort of experience that they're going to have, and that helps them have that sort of an experience. Studies, including a study by Goodman, indicate that people who are in trance are very susceptible to suggestion. And hypnotism is an extreme version of this. But people who are involved in some sort of a trance experience can be guided in terms of, hey, do you see such and such? Oh yeah, I do see such and such. It's a way that when you are given cultural programming, when you've got some sort of input coming in saying you should experience this, people will in fact disproportionately experience that type of spirit world, that type of spirit, that type of encounter. We can see this with an example. This is Napoleon Chagnon, one of our colleagues here at the University of Missouri. He's since passed away, but he taught here at the University of Missouri for a while. He worked with a group called the Yanomami. And the Yanomami have a spirit world that includes the Hekara. And the Hekara are these spirits. They're part ancestor. They're not completely ancestors, but they are up in the sky. And this is Chagnon's view as he ingested some hallucinogenic snuff and as he started interacting with the spirit. My arms seemed light and began moving almost on their own accord, rhythmically up and down at my side. I called to, I'm going to mispronounce these, Feferera and Paraborea, hot and meat-hungry Hekara, and asked them to come into my chest and dwell within me. I felt great power and confidence, and sang louder and louder, and pranced and danced in ever more complex patterns. I took up arrows and manipulated them as I had seen shamans manipulate them, striking out magical blows, searching the horizon for the Hekara, singing and singing and singing. Others joined me, and still others hid the machetes and the bows, for I announced that Rahakana Iwa dwelt within my chest and directed my actions, and all knew that he caused men to be violent. We pranced together and communed with the spirits. The point here is that Chagnon was working within a cultural system that talked about the Hekara, and he expected to see the Hekara coming down from the sky to enter into his body through his feet and finally take up dwelling within his chest. That those were expected, culturally expected experiences. And as he said here, he behaved as he had seen others behave. And so his trance experience was in part determined by culture. This is what people who are in trance experience. This is what, within this cultural context, this is what they see. And as a result, he had an experience that was very similar to what the typical Yanomami experiences as well. If you get a chance, I think it's on YouTube, but there's a wonderful documentary that Chagnon helped create with the Yanomami called Magical Death. And it's a wonderful documentary that's, is it on YouTube?
No, they pulled it down.
Did they? Okay. If perhaps through a public library or some other organization, you can get a hold of it. But it shows, it's about half hour long, and it shows Yanomami shaman interacting with the Hekara and their religious practices, and you can see exactly what Chagnon's talking about. I'm going to turn this over to Chris to talk about this. This again is reflecting the culture and the cultural structure of these altered states of consciousness.
Oh, this is the Adelaide drums. We talked about that during one of my talks to CI that we did, I don't know, about a year ago, I'm guessing. But these are the drums that the Adelaide shamans use, and it has a double of the shaman himself, but the drum itself has the spirit of the drum that's very much made animistic, human within the drum. And once the drum is struck, that being lives in the drum. And this is why drums are also dangerous and have to be put out away from the society after the shaman dies, because these are living beings that are alive. And this is what they would expect, how these things behave and work within that cultural context that Todd's talking about.
So these drums become the boat that shamans will use to access the spirit world, and they'll actually become the vehicle that the shamans can use to navigate across the spirit world and to travel as part of their shamanic experience. So in trance, this drum not only helps initiate the trance in terms of making the sounds that the shamans are using, but it becomes an active player within the trance experience, being the boat or the vessel that holds the shaman's spirit, and that protects the shaman, guides the shaman, allows the shaman to accomplish the tasks that the shaman is attempting to do. Please.
One of the Russian ethnographers that recorded talked about it's also a portable church as well, and as a boat that if a shaman is traveling, he can find lost souls along the way and then put them in the boat in the drum, and then when he gets back to this reality, then he can find the appropriate people, go there with the drum, launch the ritual, and return lost souls to people. So it's all kinds of things that are going on with the drums as well.
The point here is all of this is tied up in culture, that if you are in a cultural system that tells you this is what you're going to experience, and this is how you're going to experience the supernatural or the spirit world, these are the sorts of spirits you're going to encounter, that influences your experience in trance, because you do see the hekra, or you do ride in your drum.
So it's interesting that the drum, which is a vehicle to produce the monotone beat that does help induce that state, that it's utilized and honored and mythologized like that, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So another thing that we know impacts trance experiences is the physical setting and the posture. And this, of course, is where some of Dr. Goodman's work becomes so important. When we look cross-culturally, altered states of consciousness in religious aspects, in religious contexts, tend to correspond to different sorts of postures or unusual movements. For the Yanomami shaman, they tend to dance with what they call monkey-like movements. And there's the hekra are actually tied to ancestors, but also to monkey creatures. There's a monkey component to the hekra. And so when the shamans are dancing, they dance in ways that are not typical about the movement of somebody just going to get water or whatnot. Their movements are structured ritually to be more monkey-like, with kind of odd, unusual movements for humans. You can see that here in this upper left picture there. That's a Yanomami shaman. And you can see that's not how he normally walks around his village when he's just getting water or doing something. Of course, you've got things like the lotus position that is associated with transcendental meditation and some of these other sorts of things. You can see here on the right, this is a shaman from Oregon, correct? The northwestern coast.
Yeah, I believe so. This is Boaz's picture way back when.
Yeah.
we couldn't hear you, Christine. So
Oh, Boaz, Franz Boaz, the father of modern anthropology, American anthropology, took this picture a long time ago.
So the individual on the west or on the left, or on the right, I'm sorry. The individual on the right is from the west coast of North America, and again is in a peculiar sort of a stance relative to what people normally do as part of their daily lives. That's not how you normally just sit down and take a pose. That's atypical. And so these sorts of altered states of consciousness seem to be universally associated with atypical postures or atypical ways of movement. The altered states of consciousness in religious contexts tend to correspond to a context or a setting that is not usual, that is different and distinct, and as a result causes physiological and conceptual neurological shifts within humans. We can see this here in terms of the neurological and the physiological differences amongst humans. Sometimes there are those individuals who can respond very easily to some of these factors. So there are some people, for example, that entheogens really hit them really hard and will have a profound impact. Then there are others who may not respond quite the same way as is typical to entheogens. By the same token, some people, in terms of the social, the physical setting, may respond very heavily to that, very readily to that, and other people will not. Some of my psychologist friends, colleagues, have talked about how some people just don't seem to be hypnotizable. They cannot be hypnotized in the same way that other people can. Whereas some other folks can be readily hypnotized and can enter into those sorts of trance states very quickly. By the same
doesn't
token,
that speak to a physiological spectrum and a bell curve? Doesn't that kind of underpin the fact that we're physiologically tuned to this in some more or less degree?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is true for entheogens. This is true for cultural influence. This is true for the sort of social and physical settings. So we can talk about the neurologically or physiologically typical individual, but somebody who is not typical may respond very differently to these same sorts of settings. Just sort of thinking about it, somebody who is autistic might have a very different sort of an experience, or might have a very different sort of response to certain sorts of input compared to the neurologically or physiologically typical individual. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. What it is to say is that there's variation amongst humans. Some of this variation is going to be related to me as an individual, as well as whatever entheogens I'm using, whatever social setting I'm in, whatever culture I'm in. even if you hold those things, social, physiological setting, the ethnogen, and the culture the same, you put people and expose them to the same thing, there'll still be differences.
Yeah,
Those
nature,
differences are going to
nurture
be,
versus nurture. Yeah.
absolutely, those things are going to be reflecting whatever is different about their bodies, their minds, their neurological, hormonal, physiological structures. So all of these things come together, and a trance experience reflects all of these things. So it's not the sort of thing where you can say, hey, if you give peyote, this is always going to be the response. That it doesn't work that way. Instead, it's going to be culture is going to influence the subsequent impact of the trance experience, and social setting is going to influence this. We can actually see this. For example, we see this is an example from the Upper Paleolithic. We see individuals that folks have argued are shamans. A lot of times, these individuals who are shamans, or at least have the sort of tools that are associated with shamanism in modern contexts, a lot of times will have something different about their bodies, perhaps some form of scoliosis or some sort of a difference that we can identify from the hard parts of the skeleton that are left behind. Here's an example of Gravettian burial from the Upper Paleolithic. Had an extreme case of paresthesis. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Inflammation of the connective tissue.
We'll simply call it inflammation of the connective tissue surrounding the bone, which would be very painful. This individual would have likely been able to enter into altered states of consciousness very easily compared to the typical individual. You mentioned, Laura, the spontaneous altered states of consciousness. This individual might have had that sort of spontaneous.
Just from pain alone, are you suggesting?
The pain alone, you add into that seasonal, a lack of seasonal nutrition, which was probably typical of the Upper Paleolithic. When we look at their bodies, we can tell that they were frequently nutritionally stressed.
Yeah, the Ice Age was hard to live.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, as many ways as there were to stay alive, there were more ways to die. And that was true of the Ice Age. And this individual would have, been neurologically stressed because of the pain, because of the lack of resources, nutritional difficulties, so on and so forth. And so
but you could also surmise that maybe training, because if you can't be productive on the hunt, or you can't be a productive member of the group in this way, maybe there's that way more.
You raise a good point there, because a lot of times these burials are particularly rich in terms of grave goods and in terms of the way the body is being treated compared to many others. And so these are not cases where this individual was not seen as very useful. Rather, a lot of times these individuals seem to be central to Upper Paleolithic life, even though they would not have been particularly good hunters, even though they would not have been particularly good at doing a whole bunch of other things that you would anticipate folks would be focused on as part of the Upper Paleolithic.
Yeah, you're very uncomfortable in this realm. Try going to the other realm, and more fun for you. Bring back messages.
And as somebody who could interact with the spirit world through these sorts of trances, they may have been seen as particularly important to hunting. Because a lot of times the shaman and the folks who are interacting with the spirit world are seen as the ones who determine whether a hunt is successful or not, even more so than the hunters who go out.
Yeah, and much, much more. Right.
Yeah. So the upshot here is that a trance experience is going to reflect all of these. And I use a framework. It's a statistical framework to think about this. This is just a conceptual model. But if you're familiar with a statistical method called ANOVA, the basic idea with ANOVA is that you go and you kind of divide a pie, which represents all of your variation. And you say part of the variation is attributable to factor A, and part of the variation is attributable to factor B, and to C, and to D. But there's also going to be interaction amongst those variables that is important as well. And so ANOVA is a statistical method that allows you to divide that up and to actually look at, here's the variation that's applicable to A to B, and here's the variation that's applicable to the interaction. Now, with this, we don't have those sorts of numbers. So I'm using the ANOVA as a conceptual structure, but I'm using it as a conceptual structure that can help us kind of understand the structure or the nature of the interaction between these variables. So we've got variation in trance that's attributable to entheogens. We've got variation in trance that's attributable to culture. We've got a variation in trance that's attributable to setting, to neurology, but we also have the interaction. So here I've got a nice sort of a clinical framework up above the top picture there. Then below I've got that as a rave. And if for those of you who may not go to raves regularly, I don't. I understand that it is a very intense experience with lots of electronica music and lots of people, fast paces, The music is a driving, very loud beat and whatnot.
And light shows.
Light shows.
Mhm.
Amongst individuals who go to raves, a particular drug, MDMA or Molly, is very popular. It helps intensify the experience that they have in these raves. MDMA is also used clinically. It's used by psychologists who are treating certain sorts of mental or physical issues, in particular things like PTSD. So we know that exposure to Molly, to MDMA, will create an altered state of consciousness. But the effect of that particular dosage of MDMA will differ based on whether you're in a clinical setting or whether you're in a rave. If you're in a rave, it will be amplified based upon the cultural context. Here you are, you're with all these people, you're looking to have an intense experience. You've got the driving beat behind there, which is amplifying the impacts of the psychedelic on your brain. You've got this sort of expectation of having an intense experience and a particular type of intense experience. In fact, the DJs who lead these raves very frequently will have it orchestrated to take the folks who are there in the rave on some sort of a journey. And they talk about creating this sense of community and this journey together as they lead the participants through some sort of a sequence that takes them to a separate world. And people come out of these raves talking about the intense spiritual impact that they had from that experience. The upshot here is that we're looking at an interaction there.
Techno DJs.
Techno shamans. Yeah.
Well, also Johns Hopkins is using psilocybin in a similar clinical setting as your upper photo shows. Sound baths might be a milder form of using sound induction in a group setting. So there's a spectrum of uses on this.
Oh, absolutely. And the important thing here, the point here is that the interaction of all of these things can amplify or modify the impacts of any one of them. And so it's not
and look
just
how
simply,
shamans use this, right? They had a
Exactly.
cultural container and a very prescribed setting for the safe use of these.
Right.
So early
Exactly.
cultures did the same. Yeah.
So we cannot take a trance experience and ascribe it only to one thing. So we can't talk about the trance experience that goes along with, say, peyote or ayahuasca. Instead, we have to talk about the trance experience that reflects all of these things together, because all those things are impacting the trance experience. And so having, you've had folks on talking during the Some Sunday morning lectures, talking about ayahuasca and how they've consumed ayahuasca, but they didn't have the sorts of experience that other people have had because it wasn't the right setting, or because neurologically they weren't in the right place, or whatever it might be. So it isn't just as simple as saying, hey, do this and away you go. Instead, it's going to be reflecting all of these things put together.
I think that's one reason Goodman focused so much on ritual and the proper protocol and sequence of ritual, because that is the container. If you don't do the entheogens, that's really what you have, right?
Absolutely.
You're left that in the body posture. Yeah.
And reflecting back on the idea of suggestion, and that was part of the reason why she knew the power of suggestion and wanted people to have the experience without the information about the artifact itself, just to see by holding the body position what would happen, which kind of plays into this.
Without inputting to lead you into a particular experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thinking about this and kind of pulling aside now, so we've done some research on entheogens. We've done some research on culture, but we haven't done much research in terms of posture and the movement, the social settings of these. We've done very little on the social setting, but not much at all on the posture.
You're talking about anthropologists in general.
Absolutely. So when I say we, I'm talking about anthropologists. I'm talking about me and my group of academicians. And so one of the things that Chris in particular, but Chris and I came to realize, was that we needed to focus heavily on posture and the social setting and the context in which altered states of consciousness are being created. So we've got, for example, the Yanomamo shamans who talk about making the spirits dance. And that's because they themselves are dancing. And that posture is important. You could give them the snuff, but without the dancing, without that ritual context, they're not going to be experiencing the Hekra in the same way. It's not going to be the same sort of an experience. By the same token, though, you've got the Lakota shaman who, as part of some of their shamanic ceremonies, will actually be wrapped in blankets, put into a dark environment, tied up, all outside contact will be removed from them so that they can focus on the spirit world and interacting with the spirit world, which is the exact opposite of what the Yanomami shaman are, where the Yanomami shaman are dancing this communal setting, and they're very, very physically exhausting, very physically expressive, demanding dance movements as they go about doing their ritual ceremonies related to altered states of consciousness. Here you've got the Lakota, very different sort of situation where stillness is being emphasized to the point of actually tying people up and putting them in these dark environments, sensory deprivation.
I'll say wrapped up, not tied up, but wrapped.
Well,
Yeah.
sometimes they'll actually bind them though with rope.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
isn't it
So-
interesting? That's a form of body expression. You're dancing, your body's moving. You're lying
Absolutely.
still, your body's doing something completely different. So there's that whole spectrum, but it's all around what the body's doing or holding a
And
posture.
these are purposeful choices.
Mhm.
These folks are doing this to have an impact on the sorts of experience that they're having. So the Yanomami are dancing and doing this because that helps them have the right sort of experience that they're searching for. By the same token, the Lakota, and it's not just the Lakota, that's simply one
Well,
example.
look at the San Bushman too. That's all about the dance and the rhythms of the dance and
Oh,
the drumming and the singing
It's extremely common
around
worldwide.
the fire.
But
Yeah.
that's the point here, is that these altered states of consciousness and this structure of entering into trance is almost always associated with some different way of using the body, some
Exactly.
atypical thing. So in these religious contexts, when people are trying to interact with the spirit world, they rarely just simply say, you know what, I'm going to go sit at the table the way I do when I'm normally eating. Instead, there's something else that goes along with that. And that's having an impact on their mind. That's having an impact on their body. So if I were to adopt this position and sit there still, even if I'm not trying to do transcendental meditation, that's going to impact my pulse. That's going to impact my hormonal structure. That's going to impact my neurology. It's going to have an impact on my mind, on my body, independent of everything else, just simply being in that sort of position.
And this was what led Goodman to this research, was she had read an article on this, talking about the EEGs with this, just the mere position itself is lowering brainwaves. So absolutely. But you guys can add.
V.F. Emerson, a psychologist looking at various modalities of yoga and the passive
So the posture,
physiological impact. Yeah.
and that is something that we've not looked at. In fact, I don't think, well, I know that aside from Goodman and maybe a couple of others, we hadn't even really thought of as a serious issue. So this is one of those unknown unknowns. This is one of those things we were overlooking. And our focus here is on trying to bring this into our known knowns, our discoveries, and understand its relationship to the trance experiences.
And
Paul, looked like you were about to say something.
well, just one additional point, of course, is that this particular position transcends far beyond transcendental meditation. That's just one particular
Or yoga,
trademarked
Yeah.
practice, but this is a universal body position within the yoga community that does
Well, also we
meditation.
see very similar postures in the early
Artifacts.
indigenous
That's right,
cultures
that's
that
right.
we
Good point.
utilize as ritual instructions.
Yeah.
We see some very similar. Yeah, except for the legs. They're not quite as. Yeah, they're more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good.
So this brings us to Goodman and the ritual body posture, RBP, that Cuyamungue Institute has been studying and has been, this has been your focus in terms of trying to understand the relationship between this altered states of consciousness and using this as a means of helping people have productive, meaningful altered states of consciousness. Goodman was, of course, leading expert on creating altered states of consciousness without the use of entheogens. To my knowledge, entheogens were never used as part of CI's general practice. You all would know better than I do, but
Correct.
she didn't
We've
talk
never
about it.
seen any entheogens being passed around. No. Yeah.
Yeah. And so these ritual body postures that she defined using ethnographic and archaeological evidence. You all, again, are the leading experts on this. You just sent me a database, and it sounds like there are even more postures that have been defined since then based on archaeological and ethnographic evidence of these sorts of ritual structures, these ritual body postures that people use to initiate or to influence the altered state of consciousness, their experience that they're having. So again, I'm talking about your all's bread and butter here. Please pipe up as we're talking about this. But the basic structures is rather straightforward. the ritual body posture is paired with a fast beat from a drum or a rattle, 210 beats per minute. This reliably produces trance. Different postures seem to produce different experiences in trance. Goodman refers to this as a radio, where like with a radio, you can turn the dial, and the radio is a radio, but you turn the dial and sometimes you can get one sort of program, next time you get another sort of program when you turn the dial. These postures seem to key in to different sorts of programs. And so in the same way that you have a country station and you have a classic rock station, here you can adopt one posture, which will correspond to certain sorts of experiences. And then you can adopt a different posture, which will correspond to different sorts of experiences. Now, just like a radio where the song that's being played is not going to be the exact same song as played 5 minutes before or 10 minutes after, people have different sorts of experiences. And so it isn't the sort of thing where I adopt this particular posture here that Paul has for us. If I adopted this, I might have a different experience than Paul would in the same posture. But there ought to be some underlying structures to those experiences, in the same way that there's some underlying structures amongst country songs that are being shared.
Yeah, interesting analogy. Yeah, and indeed we do find that spontaneously.
chords
And
of
indeed,
different
it's interesting how an antenna is bent in a certain configuration to tune to
Right.
station A or station B. And we've likened that. We're bending our body into an antenna configuration.
Back in the old
has
days
been
when
one
we
of the
used-
theories, yeah.
Back in the old days when we did use antennas, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good analogy.
Oh yeah, it's an ancient technology itself, isn't it?
Maybe some people in the audience don't know what we're talking about. What's an antenna?
And so the idea here is that there may even be some cases where there's some overlap, like you can get with a song where you have a hit that is being played on both the country station and the rock station at the same time. It's kind of an overlap. You can have situations where these postures will produce sort of overlapping experiences, but at least possibly these postures correspond to certain sorts of experiences that are distinct in some ways from other sorts of postures. And so my recollection is that 8 different types of postures have been defined. Now, that's not to say that you have over 80 different postures that Cuyamungue Institute uses on a regular basis.
Oh,
But
more
those
than
are-
80. Yeah, more than
Yeah.
80.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Those are categorized into 8 different categories, though. So there's healing, for example, which corresponds to certain sorts of experiences. There's divination, which corresponds to other sorts of experiences, and so on and so forth. And each of those categories will have multiple postures underneath them. But the idea here is that different postures produce different sorts of experiences because it's having a physiological and a neurological impact. We don't understand why that's happening. In other words, I can't look at this particular posture here that Paul has for us and say, hey, here's what's going on neurologically. We'd like to get to that point. In fact, Chris and I are starting to work with you all to study that. So we need to do some work with the EEGs. And go ahead,
May I
Chris.
just ask me that, thinking about Todd's model, one of the things that we like about Goodman's work and with this model is that your work and Goodman's, it cut out the cultural overlay. And so the CI database is really useful because it's helping us winnow out these different variables so we can start isolating the interactions on less variables. So that's one of the things that will be useful because we're not throwing in the Olmec from the get-go and having that, shift it so we can more closely look at what's going on with that posture, not with the Olmec cultural overload.
That's critical.
just
That's critical
basic.
to the overall
Almost
development of the
critical.
database and research. Yes, absolutely.
What does physiology alone, what is posture alone, what is sound alone? Yeah.
Right.
So building on the point that Chris made and that you all just made here, this is the basic structure as I understand it that you all follow in when you're typically doing a posture work. And so, you'll call in the spirits using burning sage or some other form of incense, do a breathing exercise, which is not hyperventilating or anything like that. Rather, it's just sitting down and relaxing for a couple of minutes, breathing for 5 minutes or thereabouts. While holding a particular ritual body posture, you'll listen to a beat for 210 beats per minute for 15 minutes, and then participants will reliably enter into trance for some or all of that 15-minute period. I suspect that many of you who are watching this have actually experienced this yourself during one of the workshops that CI has hosted either via Zoom or in person.
Mm-hmm.
The trance then ends when the instrument stops, and participants will journal their experiences, then they'll share their experiences. Then the ritual will be closed by thanking the spirits. Then and only then will the leaders, Paul or whoever might be leading it, give the origin of the posture. So as Chris was just saying, this eliminates the whole idea of, here's what's going to happen. You're going to experience this. And then there are going to be these beings that come from the sky and all that stuff. Instead, people have the experience, report the experience, and then you'll share that sort of cultural overlay with them so that you're not directing them into how they're going to have the altered state of consciousness experience, their trance experience. They instead tell you what they experienced. And this is really important because this means then that people report kind of independent of these other factors, exactly as Chris was saying, their experiences where we can look at the impact of the posture itself, as opposed to saying, and then they were coached in terms of what they were going to
The
experience.
Hekara will come down and
Yeah. I'll also add, just to honor Todd for a moment, is that he is an independent researcher. He's not a community member that's a practitioner of this work. He's just been watching us from the side and documenting it. So watching Todd give an introductory presentation to our work is very satisfying to see how he's been able to digest and see how the work works. You know? So
I want to, Chris, ask you for just a moment. What do you surmise when you started to attend our sessions from start to finish? And then during the sharing, people would have so many commonalities amongst their experience per that session, per that posture chosen. And then the next one, a different posture, some across the board similarities that we always have, but then unique to that session, different set of commonalities. How did you, in your work, and how did you view that? What did you make of that phenomenon that happens consistently?
surprised.
one word.
Yeah, so one word, surprise. Laura and I have spent a lot of time talking about the whole phenomenon. And so one word explains everything. Surprised with how similar their experiences were within a session. And of course, as a scientist, I would say, well, that's because of human physiology. Okay. But, you know, I'm an anthropologist, so I still think culture is really important. And the interesting thing that I was surprised was how across different cultures, because we people all around the world, as you know, joining you on a Saturday morning, that seemed like people with vastly different cultures seem to be having very similar experiences. I'm like, okay, so it has to be all physiological. But then there are other things going on behind the scenes where pinball imagery appears in our trance states, which was surprising. And it's like, how do we explain that? That shouldn't be occurring. So, but I think that even though and I was also surprised because I think there's so much commonality that we should be able to do research. And then I'm not surprised because there's something at work, but ultimately a lot of surprises. And I think that this is really rewarding because those surprises will lead to hopefully better questions, better ways of thinking about things, better research. And then poor Todd, he got to listen to a lot of these surprises and hear me talk a lot. I'm like, hey, you want to hear what happened to me today in France? You want to hear what my experience today? And then it was later, I mean, not trying to, inundate him with too much stuff. He's like, so what happened today? And then I'm like, fast. So surprise is the best word along the whole process for 3 years.
I want to just say one thing. The pinball reference was we were at my sister's big barn where a friend had parked her pinball machine. Who walks around with a pinball machine? Yeah, so her friend needed to park this pinball machine while she moved. So here was this.
So we were holding a Zoom session remotely
in that barn, in that big room.
Barn.
Yeah, and then one gal in the session said, What is Dorothy from the Wizard of Oz doing here, in my trance? Well, the pinball machine was all about Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
And we had not mentioned that. But we were like, really? Because there's the pinball machine right over there, out of view, but it's like right over there. That was interesting. The other thing is, how does this work relate to the shamanic cultures that you study? Because so often symbols come up, right? This is the language of spirit, as we call it: symbol, gesture, direct knowing, the iconography, gesture. All of this comes up in our trance, and you so often related it to some of the pots behind you from the cultures that you've studied, where the symbol has a particular meaning, but we have people describing that either by
Experientially
symbol or
without-
experience or message that they
Right.
got that related
Mhm.
directly. Do you want to just say a few words about that?
Again, I was surprised because even though we could say, well, we have a predisposition for human neurology to have this experience, and we know shamans are doing a lot of different things. They're not just doing a position or ethnogens. Shamans are doing lots of multiple things in very specific ways to, if you will, make sure they have the right experience for themselves and their clients. So lots of stuff is going on, very complex rituals, very complex things. So a bunch of different things. What surprised me about this was how you can have someone like me in, 30 minutes on a Saturday, not knowing, and this was really good that we were in COVID, that we were in lockdown. My Felicitas Goodman book was in my campus office where they would not allow anybody on campus. You were not allowed, all the buildings locked. So here we were at home. And so I didn't know the postures being held like everybody else. So here I am, little old me, knowing nothing about the posture being held, nothing. And then channeling up this information that when they show, they being Laura and Paul, the artifact from which the posture came, I'm like, holy smokes, I'm surprised. That's exactly like blah, 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 blah from the cultural that it came from, the culture. It's like the posture ended up giving us a really closely related similarities, what we could talk about cosmology or worldview from these cultures. And that was shocking. That was surprising. And then I got thinking there's something much more going on that I cannot explain as a scientist. I don't even know the right questions to ask. I just know that there is something much more complex that I don't even have a word for. And Laura and I, and Paul too, and Todd have talked about, we don't even have the right terminology to create to talk about the way to write the question, to understand. It's almost like psychic research or something into the past, psychic archaeology. And I hate to say that, that's not a good word, but the surprise was how holding a posture for 15 minutes with this breathing exercise can have us recreate an entire world cosmology, a religious perspective in a 15-minute session where you have 30 people and each one has a piece of the proverbial cosmological pie, and how close it is to that ancient culture. That was surprising. And yeah, I don't know, I'm getting too far over, but to answer your question, there's more stuff going on. And the surprise that I'm so excited to work with you guys, with Todd, with Tony, with Fred, with Carolyn, because we don't know enough about what's actually happening. And there's so many things and even basic words we need to come up with to start to really understand and ask the right questions and begin to understand this huge phenomenon in a plausible way. I know that's not very gratifying, but that's what's exciting about this research.
I think it's an exciting adventure.
Yeah, it is.
And we're in fresh turf here, right?
Exactly. Goodman opened the proverbial doorway, the ritual doorway for spirit key and spirit doorway, her terms, but how the doorway opens and how it works and what's coming through and why it works and how people in the past understood and how they did it. I mean, just so many. I have far more questions than I have any type of, I don't even have the language to ask the right questions yet.
Well, I'll also
and the benefits of it, the deep meaning of culture. If this was so important that they encoded this in their cosmology, these kinds of discoveries, these kind of messages,
whether
these kinds of
consciously
insights,
or unconsciously,
and that it's something that our culture can partake of today. Is it something eternal? Is it something that is meant to be? Is it a substrate that we haven't yet tapped into in our culture? How did we lose it? And how can we regain this? And what does it mean? And how does it benefit us all? Right? It's such interesting questions.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, and this is where I kind of came into a lot of the analysis, because I could hear what was going on. And at first I just thought that this was really kind of going to be research about sound induction and the way to use sound to create altered state of consciousness. But when, for example, Chris and others were reporting about seeing serpents and Chinese dragons and the feathered serpent, it turned out to be the feathered serpent posture. And I started seeing some statistical associations that caused me to think, no, the postures actually matter. It isn't just simply that you're doing something that leads you to have an altered state of consciousness. Rather, the postures themselves are a central key, which is what Felicitas was saying, what Dr. Goodman was saying, and I think she's right. Paul, I think I interrupted you.
Well, not at all. I was just going to add to that conversation because the question did come up in the chat room. So from an analytical point of view of being able to collect the data, it has been important for us to follow the proper protocol of not showing artifacts until the end. However, of course, those that are on advanced programs recognize and do the postures, and the question comes up, well, is the posture still effective? Of course. Is my experience being impacted by the fact that I know what the artifact is? Yes. And at the same time, that's all good and powerful. So we're not discounting that, because obviously there's books published with the artifacts in the books from the very beginning of the Institute.
Goodman's and
yeah,
Gore's
all the way
included.
back. So we know that that exists, and we're not discounting that. We're just simply saying for the work to go forward, the original protocol that Goodman did at the university level with her students, she would have the student just hold a posture and introduce sound. One student at a time.
In the context of the ritual.
In
which
the
is very
context,
important.
yes, and then she would have them journal. So she did this and did this. So that protocol became the protocol of the Institute with students even after her service as a professor at the university. So we're still following that protocol for the benefit of pushing the data forward, pushing the practice forward, finding out more and more and more about what the practice can be, because we're really trying to separate, and this was important to her, to separate out the woo-woo, which is a kind of a catch-all term for a lot of stuff in this world we live in, to that which she felt as an anthropologist she could be proud of, that she could do something that had real credence and it had credibility. It was important to her to have credibility and not just be thrown into the soup of woo-woo. So we've done that, even though, like I'm saying, of course you can see the artifact and have experiences. It's just it's not critical to the overall progress of the data that we're collecting to push the work forward.
Look at me. I know all the postures intimately by
and
heart. I've been doing this for like so many years. So you go into a trance and you let go.
Yeah.
You just listen to the drumming. You're using a different part of your mind. You're parking your intellect off to the side. It's not you're witnessing. It's a different mode of thinking. And then you let go.
And the final thing I'll say is that, and Todd gave the perfect analogy, just because you turn the radio to a country music station, you're not going to hear the same music over and over. It's going to be different tunes and different variations.
It seems to be purposeful. It seems to be purposeful and not random. You
cut off my one-liner. I just said if you turn it to a country station, you're still going to have the pickup truck and the dog, but they're going to be different variations of that.
Infinite variations on the theme.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Todd. Todd.
Oh, interesting.
Thanks for that interlude.
We could talk for years on this. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
I just want to add one more thing, and this goes to what Todd's getting at and what we're trying to do statistically. It's really curious how you can hold the feather serpent posture. And wow, the first time I finally had a trance go, I wasn't so sure the first couple times I did, but to have a Chinese dragon flying at me, or holding what we all know and love as the bear posture, and feeling your hands turn into big mitts, paws of a bear, feeling that is, there has to be something physiological driving all this, and people must maybe at some level knew it in the past, but there is a physiological connection with the mind that is impacting our experience. There is something probably real and tangible between the postures holding that we end up feeling bear or seeing flying serpents or whatever. But I'm just saying there's some type of causal mechanism. Now how and why that works is a whole nother question, but it has to be there at some level. Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
And Todd, one more thing, sorry, because this has come up in the chat room 2 or 3 times now as well. How important is the 210 beats per minute? And this conversation is going on in the chat room. And I just want to mention that she wanted to find that medium of optimizing the experience. Can people trance at 120? Yes. Can they trance at 240? Yes. But this is what she found to be the most comfortable zone of sound and the beats per minute that seemed to be that she could repeat over and over as part of the practice. So we've chosen 210, and sometimes it's not a full 210, and sometimes it's a little bit more than 210.
She said 200
but
to 210.
It's in the pocket. It's in the pocket.
Beats per minute.
Yeah.
Also, it was the Goldilocks technique. Tony was asking, how did she happen on that? This was before anybody was doing studies on that.
Yeah.
And it was the Goldilocks. Well, this is too fast. This is optimal. Again, that bell curve.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I just also want to say that what's interesting to me, right, is the folklore, the mythologies that I see trance journeys imprint all over it, but also the upper world, middle world, lower world, the world tree. Like some of this iconography that you can see across the world is what people who don't know anything about that experience and report in their trance. It's a topography there that is shared worldwide from direct experience. People go in there innocently and they find the same things. They hear the same beautiful, eternal, reassuring messages. They see the perspective. They see this connection between Earth and the cosmos. It's just fascinating. Yeah. So anyway, enough said.
Back to Professor
Join our
VanPool.
community host program for more. If you'd like to dive into this. Back to you, Professor Todd VanPool.
You all, I think, are hitting on some key things there, and I agree with you that the fact that so many people can have such similar experiences is reflecting that cognitive archaeology that I was talking about earlier, the sort of the structure of humans responding as humans to these sorts of things. I do want to build on the discussion you all were just having there, talking about the guided and the unguided sort of experiences. And Goodman was not the only one who's kind of working in this sort of realm. And I think the single biggest person who was sort of similar, pursuing similar sorts of frameworks that is well known is, of course, Harner, Michael Harner's work. And there's a lot of similarities between what Michael Harner was doing, what Felicitas Goodman was doing, but they're certainly not the same. So Harner came up with this universal shamanism, for those who might be familiar with it. It used sound induction as well, and sound induction is just simply the beating of a drum or a rattle.
He coined the term sound induction, yeah.
Indeed, so 240 beats per minute. But what is very different between Harner's work and what Dr. Goodman was doing was that Harner actually called his trance leaders shamans, and they had a very guided experience. In fact, if you look at the book, The Way of the Shaman here, there's a bulleted point of here's what you tell the people who are in trance. First, you say you're going to be entering into this tunnel and go through, and then at the end of it, you find your spirit guide or whatever the trance might be focused on. There he uses, this is not meant critically for him. This is not being critical of the system, but there he uses a guided experience to help ensure that the participants have some sort of a desired outcome at the end of the experience. That's different from what Goodman was doing, which, as Laura was saying there, it was an unguided experience of you give yourself over to the sound, and then you have whatever experience you're going to have. For our purposes, given that we're trying to understand the relationship between the altered state of consciousness and the posture, the unguided experience is what's going to be able to give us some information about the influence of the posture. Mm-hmm. Plus, Harner didn't have the sorts of posture work that Goodman had. So Goodman defined over 60 postures to begin with. Now that's grown in at least over 80. From what Paul was saying, it could be over 100. I don't know how many postures y'all have defined, but that's a whole bunch of postures. Whereas what Harner was working on, posture was important for what Harner was talking about. He, in fact, says have your participants go into this sort of a posture.
Lay on the ground, and it's actually one of Goodman's from Ecuador is one of the ones that Harner uses. She got it out of Harner, right?
Right.
She did, and it's one of the few where we have an eyewitness report of shamans intentionally lying down in that posture for that particular trance state.
They had a respectful colleague kind of.
Yeah, they did. They were friends and colleagues. Yeah.
And so what Harner was doing and what Harner's work does, which again has lots of adherents and obviously corresponds to altered states of consciousness and corresponds to very powerful spiritual experiences, isn't in opposition with or in competition with what Goodman does. They're different, but they actually agree with each other in substantial ways. But Goodman's approach is much more useful for us in terms of our research, in terms of trying to understand the influence posture has compared to what Harner does. So some basic questions here. Do people actually go into trance when they're adopting a ritual body posture? The answer is yes. Goodman and others have produced physiological evidence. They've used EEGs and hormonal analysis, physiological characteristics like measuring heartbeat and the blood pressure. We can document that neurologically and physiologically people shift as part of the RBP experience. We can see that certain hormones are being pulled out of the bloodstream, other hormones are being released in the bloodstream. The upshot is that people, after they go through ritual body posture, feel a lot better. They've got some endorphins that are going, some of the cortisol and some of the negative sorts of hormones that correspond to stress have been pulled out of the bloodstream. People feel good, they feel rejuvenated. And so those of you who have experienced RBP or have used RBP to enter into altered states of consciousness have probably experienced this yourself. But it actually does, people do go into trance as part of what Goodman recommends, using that structure that Goodman uses, the structure that you all use. We can demonstrate physiologically that people have altered neurological and physiological responses. We also have the personal accounts, and in anthropology, these sorts of personal accounts are our bread and butter. We talk to people all the time, and so we use personal accounts for ethnographic accounts to talk to people about these sorts of topics. So the sorts of personal experiences that CI has accumulated over the years are outstanding from an anthropological perspective as a source of information. And then, of course, we have Chris, who has been doing this in participant observation. You two have both been doing this for years, participant observation, talking about the nature of the altered states of consciousness. So we've got a secure data set that indicates that people really do go into trance with RBPs. Because when I'm explaining this to my colleagues, a lot of times they're kind of looking at me askew saying, you're telling me that people can listen to a beating of a drum for 15 minutes and have these experiences? I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And saying that is really no different than saying, and I can give you this pill and you're going to swallow it. You're also going to go into altered state of consciousness. They'll accept that. But it just seems so outside of the normal range of experience to think that, you know, listening to the drum, going through all of this stuff, you can go enter into an altered state of consciousness.
Hey, we say it's an open invitation. You can try it and test it for yourself, or you can witness the results. Yeah.
Right.
I see that Fred has got his hand up. Did you want to?
Sure. Fred, do you want to chime in? Go ahead and turn on your.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I guess I just want to ask, I suppose, Paul and Laura, as well as Chris and Todd, the question I just put up on the chat, which is that, is there any kind of consistent experience, a shamanic experience, once certain kind of body postures are prescribed or followed, as opposed to when they're not, that you know about? I mean, Chris, I know you've been doing, and Todd, you've been doing this kind of research. I just wonder about this.
We're actually working on a paper studying this, and so we don't have all the data crunched. Preliminary, the answer is yes. That it looks like that, in fact, the postures do correspond to different sorts of experiences, such that if you have people in the same session who might be adopting the bear posture versus the feathered serpent posture, I think the answer would be that they're going to have different experiences based upon that posture. Now we're just at we're still in the data gathering stage, but what I'm seeing with the data that we've gathered indicates that is the case.
And let me just add that from the ethnographic record, I cannot answer that question because shamans use so many different rituals and they do so many different things from season to season, time to time, or, you know, one healing, you know, a healing for one client may necessitate a slightly different approach than the next client. And so within the ethnography is a lot more variables. And so that's really hard to tease out an ethnographic record, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. But as far as Paul and Laura, who've been guiding these sessions for years and years, you must have some kind of
but this is where this is so exciting, right? So if we can take all these experiences and start data crunching, and that's where Todd comes in. Right. But following their hypotheses, what they think's going on, and then seeing if Todd can. I don't want to jump Todd because he's actually going to try to get into this, and he has some really great ways of how he's trying to tease out those experiences with statistics. So I'm going to be quiet.
Well, it's interesting to have the subjective experience be analyzed statistically, because when we have, like you said, Christine, when you have 30 something people and there's such an overlay of a specific experience, and then you change postures and the next posture is totally different, and yet the overlay exists again with a new posture in a different way. So that's what we'll go to next, I think. Hopefully.
I also want to say that there are certain experiences further answer Fred's question that are across the board. For example, heat. There's no heat in the room. You feel very, very hot or very cold. There's wind. You feel wind. You see wind. You feel it across your face. There's no wind in the room. or time is very short, feels like 5 minutes, it's been 15 minutes of drumming,
Right,
or it
right.
feels timeless.
Those are the
So,
universal.
and your inner senses just turn on. You experience synesthesia often. You experience senses you didn't know you had in an inner way. It gets really interesting. So across the board, there's similarities, but then there will be the unique commonalities per that category, per that posture, or per that session.
Right.
And it's been interesting
So
for
we're
us
crunching the data.
yeah,
We're crunching the
consider
data.
all that.
So
Yeah.
that's where Todd comes in and shows us how to
Yes.
properly take all this
What a
information
team we're
we
working
collect.
with.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Back to
So,
you.
Back to you.
Sure. So kind of building on what you all were just saying there, do we have dreamlike experiences in terms of the experiences that people report as a result of ritual body postures? I have 3 dreams here that reflect different sorts of dreams. The one on the left is one of the most famous prophetic dreams. It's from Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Bible. And the one in the middle is just a standard old dream. It was recorded as part of analysis of dreams. Then the one on the right is an experience that was reported by somebody as part of the data that was collected by CI. So you can see with the prophetic dream, I saw 4 animals rise from the ocean: a winged lion with human feet, a bear chewing on a rib bones, a winged leopard with 4 heads, and a beast with 10 horns and iron teeth that destroyed the other animals. That's very, for want of another term, outlandish. That is not sort of the typical thing that I see walking down the street. It doesn't make a lot of sense from sort of a rational perspective, but that's a prophetic dream there. Here's a regular dream. While walking towards a city, a man found a wooden disc like a frisbee, and so the man here is the man who's reporting the dream. He threw the disc, it flew into the ocean and sank. The man tried to find it, but it suddenly became dark. There was a tremendous explosion. Debris rained down on the beach. The man was fine, but others around him were hurt. Then a helicopter came, and he tried to help the injured. Again, this sort of fits together into a coherent framework, but like all dreams, it doesn't really make sense when you think about it. Suddenly becoming dark and whatnot. We all have experienced dreams, and it's like they don't really make much sense. That's just the nature of the dreams. And then here on the right, we've got orbs of light. Just a second, I've got to change things because I can't see everything. Orbs of light began to spin around, making vortex. Then 2 children came and led me down into a dungeon. They showed me a pile of dead bones that were still chained. And I said, I don't like this. Just take me out of here. And they said, these were the bones of your fears. We want you to dance and stomp on these bones until they're dust. This was an experience that somebody reported as part of a CI-sponsored workshop. The upshot is that these are dreamlike in the sense of they have the basic structure, the sort of stream of consciousness structure that's very common with dreams. And so the sorts of experiences that people report with the ritual body postures are consistent with the sorts of dreams that people report from different sorts of dreams. Now, I think that if we were to take a look at this, and I think statistically I can actually differentiate between these 3 sorts of dreams, but I haven't done that research yet. But the upshot is that the sorts of dreams that people have while engaged in ritual body postures are not that different from the sorts of dreams that they have when they're asleep. They still follow a basic structure that is coherent. And so I'm going to just skip this one here. But in terms of looking at the medieval period and the archaeological record where Chris and I have been doing our work, the medieval period was a part of the Casas Grandes culture of northern Chihuahua down in Mexico and on up into southern New Mexico. The medieval period was from about AD 1200 to 1450. It was a time period of high levels of cultural complexity and social differentiation within this region, one of the most complex cultures to be around in the prehistoric New World. In the North America, certainly not rivaling anything, say, down in Mesoamerica, but these were some folks who had some social differentiation and some political complexity. They had a religious system that seems to be based on shamanism, and it was a tobacco-based shamanic ritual system. And so they were ingesting tobacco as part of their ritual activity, and tobacco is a very powerful entheogen. We tend not to think of it that way. People who smoke talk about how tobacco helps them feel kind of good. But the native tobacco is extremely potent and can really knock you off your feet because it's so powerful. There's so much nicotine in it. And the tobacco that we smoke as part of cigarettes are actually regulated by the US government to make sure that they're not that powerful. There's a whole reason why that's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms as part of the ATF. The tobacco is an important part there because it is in fact a very powerful hallucinogenic drug when taken in the wrong context. People who are experimenting with the vapes have been finding this. The nicotine intoxication can actually be very profound. The Casas Grandes shamanism took place in dark environments. This is one of the places where Chris and I think a lot of the shamanistic activity was occurring. This is from inside of a site called Pakime. And so you're looking at this picture here, see those stairs going down. Fair enough. You can see the stairs going down. This is deep inside Pakime, or it's also called Casas Grandes. Pakime is a better term because it keeps it clear when you're talking about the culture versus the site. But this particular site had deep inside of the room block, the main room block where people were living, this walk-in well. And this walk-in well was dug down into the ground, down to the groundwater level. People had thrown a whole bunch of stuff into the water, around the water. So this is not the sort of well where you could go down and you could get potable water to drink. Instead, this was a special place with controlled access. You actually stepped over the skull of a human that was buried at the entryway here to enter into this area. This is a special sort of ceremonial location. And adjacent to this walk-in well was this little room, a completely dark room. You wouldn't have been able to build a fire down there for very long because the ventilation just wasn't that good. You'd quickly choke yourself out. So the people who use this room were using it in darkness. It was designed to be a very dark room. Probably a controlled access here. This is where the shamans were probably doing a lot of their work, and this is also where most of the pipes were found. And it's associated with a shamanic ritual that was found in nearby rooms. So this is probably where these tobacco shamans, or at least one of the places where they were doing their activity. And this is the result of a lot of Chris's work. She did this as part of her dissertation and then published it in a 2003 American Antiquity article and then a book in 2007. But if you look here, you'll see individuals. You'll see how they go from being living humans who are just simply smoking a pipe, ingesting the tobacco, on up to these birdmen who are flying through the spirit world. And so if you see those little pound signs on the legs of this smoker effigy down on the lower left corner there.
Hashtags. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Hashtags. Yeah.
Hashtags. Yeah. These are very unusual symbols on Casas Grandes pottery. We don't find them very often. In fact, we only find them on these sorts of individuals and then on individuals that look like they're spirits or they're supernatural. So here you've got an individual. He's male. You can see the penis there. We don't find this on women, with one exception, but we'll not talk about that right now. But we do find these symbols on these smokers. And here you see this individual who's holding this kind of atypical posture. He's smoking one of these pipes. We do find these pipes at Pakime. We've not tested them for tobacco residue, but these pipes are similar to pipes that have been used by ethnographic groups in the Southwest for smoking tobacco. Then you look over, next image there, you'll see the little pound signs, little hashtags there on this individual's chest. You'll see he's wearing a headdress there, a horned serpent headdress. If you look, you'll see a forward-pointing horn and a mouth with the feathers coming off the back. That is very consistent with the horned serpent imagery that we see in the Casas Grandes region. The horned serpent is a water deity, extremely important to the Puebloan folk of the Southwest, but also very important to the Casas Grandes people. They had a huge mound that was reflecting.
He's Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent as well. So he's important in both parts of the world.
But they had this huge mound over a football field length mound at Pakime in the shape of these horned serpents. And so these horned serpents are found on their pottery. They're found as a mound in at the site. They're repeated and reinforced in the iconography at rock art and in other places. And so these horned serpents were extremely important to the Casas Grandes people. If you go to the next image there, you'll see the pound signs as well. And as Chris just said, the horned serpents and the feathered serpents, more so feathered serpents than horned serpents, were extremely important to Mesoamerican cultures as well. Quetzalcoatl, and these other deities were also feathered serpents. Each group had a various form of feathered serpent. If you go next to that one, you'll see where the horned serpent headdress is off to the side. This is from a different pot. And you'll see that there's the little pound signs there. And you see that the man is growing a horn out of his own head. He's transforming into what previously had only represented. You'll also see that he's kind of in an odd position, like he's flying. If you go up to the image on the top, you'll see what looks like a macaw-headed individual there, got a strange bird associated with him. These sorts of birds are associated with these shamans, these individuals with these hashtags, these pound signs, consistently. They don't correspond to any sort of a known bird in the Southwest. Kind of the closest we can come up with is a roadrunner, but that doesn't really look like a roadrunner, not really. The Casas Grandes had a tendency to show animals in a way that you could depict them even down to the species. You could even say, this owl is a horned owl or a barn owl. And so the fact that we've got this bird that is so consistently repeated, but doesn't correspond to a species is unusual. In fact, it's unique in the Casas Grandes region. He also has underneath his arm a horned serpent. If you can see it there, you've got the mouth, he's upside down, you got the mouth, you got the eye, and then you got the horn going around. And so this is showing that this individual is in flight with this bird and with a horned serpent, holding a horned serpent under his arm. This is a classic shamanic journey. This is what we see worldwide in terms of shamans who are using trance to enter into altered states of consciousness to interact with the spirit world. It's a type of experience called a soul flight, which is very common worldwide. And the idea here is that the shaman will enter into a trance and their spirit will actually be able to access upper world or a lower world through this process of soul flight. Again, this is something that Cuyamungue Institute participants have reported on many occasions. The accounts I've looked at have talked about soul flight as part of the experiences that people have had when they're participating with the CI activities. Now, the posture that we see those shamans holding, here you see the medieval period Casas Grandes posture. We actually see this posture across the New World, and even in some cases in the Old World, in Egypt, for example. This is one of the postures that Goodman identified, and she called it the Tennessee diviner posture. She did that based on this artifact that's on the left. This is Sandy. It's a Tennessee state artifact. So this is the artifact that Tennessee uses as in the same way that states will have a state bird or whatnot. Most states have a state artifact, and this is Tennessee's state artifact. It's a very famous artifact. It's made out of a stone which will actually glow when it's heated up, which is pretty cool. And so Thomas Woolforth and Lynn Woolforth have published an article talking about these images, and this is one of 11 images or statuaries like this that have been found in the Southeast throughout in many different states. So this is not a singular item that we see in Tennessee. Rather, there are other examples of this found throughout the Southeast. But you look at the similarity in terms of the posture between what the medieval period people are doing and what we see there in this Mississippian period. These are contemporaneous groups, but they don't have any direct contact. They're not trading a whole bunch of stuff with each other. We don't see them interacting with each other intensely. Instead, what we're seeing is that they're adopting the same sort of ritual posture. So we see a number of effigies in the Casas Grandes region showing the same basic posture. We see a number of effigies in Tennessee and surrounding states showing the same posture. We actually see this posture clear down into Mesoamerica among the Olmec and other groups in Mesoamerica. And so this is a posture that seems to be used through time, that's found in a lot of different places, and not found amongst folks who are directly talking with each other. So it's not as if the Casas Grandes people are sending emissaries to Tennessee to say, hey, tell us what you're doing. Instead, this seems to be a posture that's being used in both these areas, largely independent of each other, at least in terms of contemporary relationships. So the Tennessee diviner posture for Goodman's work. We're early in our research, but looking at what Goodman reported, looking at the information that CI has been able to provide us, our analysis indicates that Goodman is correct when she called the Tennessee diviner posture a diviner posture that is used to answer questions. It is associated with feelings of spinning, it's associated with feelings of flight, it's associated with feelings of dark environments and darkness, going into dark places. But more significantly, it seems to be a sort of posture that people get answers as a result of. So they'll ask a question, they'll get an answer of, here's the answer to your question. And so people talk about things they learned or things that they were wondering about that they got answers for.
Thought we were told we were asking the wrong question.
Or you're perhaps being told you're asking the wrong questions. I guess Chris had an experience like that as part of this. This is not typical for other postures. With other postures, you might get, for example, with healing postures, you get different sorts of experiences. And with metamorphosis postures, you get different sorts of experiences. And so this experience is different from what is typical of other sorts of postures. This image here on the you see, this is also from a Casas Grandes pot. This is a Medi-period pot. This is reflecting the shaman there in the spirit world. You'll see the hashtags again. You'll see the individual with the macaw head. You'll see the tail feathers coming off of it right there in the center. Hopefully y'all can see that image. You'll also see that the individual's interacting with horned serpents, horn plume serpents. And so you can see the serpent with the forward pointing horn and the backward pointing plumes. There's also this sort of a macaw headed figure. We call it the double-headed diamond macaw, or macaw diamond, I'm sorry, the double-headed macaw diamond. We don't really know what this is. It might be related to Venus or some sort of the sun. We're not 100% certain of what it is, but the macaw itself is associated with sun imagery in the Casas Grandes world and more broadly throughout the Southwest. And so that probably is related to the sun or the heavens in some way. The horned serpent is an underwater deity in many contexts, not all contexts, but in many contexts in the Southwest and even down in Mesoamerica, where the horned serpent will be down in the ground, come out of a cave or whatnot, and help herd clouds through the sky to bring rain, things like that. So this could be reflecting an upper world and lower world imagery. But the upshot here is that we see these shamans going on a soul flight and interacting with these important supernatural entities as part of the tobacco shamanism in the Casas Grandes region.
Chris, could you talk about the macaw bird and the Quetzalcoatl and how they were honored and utilized and found widely? You spoke to that before.
Yeah, in Mesoamerica, the quetzal was an important bird. It had beautiful green plumage, very, very long. And the Aztec feathered serpent is domed with quetzal feathers. In the northern Mexico, we think they're probably, and we can only hypothesize this because we do not have the feathers survived in archaeological context, but it may be that they put parrot feathers, scarlet macaws on their images. And so in Zuni, New Mexico, their horn serpent, plume serpent has actually turkey feathers put on. And so we see a lot of variations of that thought process. So up in this part of the world, Pakime had over 300 scarlet macaws ritually sacrificed and put into pit burials. And so they're actually using the macaws, not the quetzals. But in Meso to the Maya lowlands, they're using the quetzals, and it's important. So there's probably some type of symbolic shift. Does that make sense?
Those two birds are closely related symbolically. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So going back to what I was saying about the sort of ANOVA approach in which we can look at the different slices of the pie and how we can look at factor A and factor B and factor C, then we can look at their interaction to produce the trans outcome. We've got tobacco, and our ethnographic research of tobacco indicates that tobacco intoxication and trance based upon tobacco intoxication corresponds to feelings of soul flight, a loss of color, vortexes, feelings of dizziness, vertigo, birds and snake imagery, and divination. So groups who use tobacco use it for divination, to get questions answered. They see snakes, they see birds, they go through vortexes to enter into another world as part of soul flight. The Casas Grandes culture, as you can see from this image here, we have horned serpents, we have water control, we have macaw and color symbolism related to this. And so I can't go through all of our evidence for horned serpents, water control, macaw, and color symbolism. Here's part of this presentation, but our previous research has indicated that this is the core. This is the core of the shamanic experience that the Casa Grande shamans are attempting to have when they enter into trance. Then the Tennessee diviner posture, based upon Goodman's work and the work that Paul and Laura have done, is associated with soul flights, vortexes, dark environment, transformations, and divination. You look at these three different things. So you got the influence of the tobacco, you've got the influence of the culture, you've got the influence of the Tennessee diviner posture. This particular posture seems to be associated with these sorts of experiences. They correspond with each other.
Build on each other.
Of course, these are conscious choices that people are having. So they are desiring a particular sort of trance experience. But the tobacco, Tennessee diviner posture, and then their own cultural preferences, their own cultural goals are coming together to help create a very powerful experience that's consistent based upon the different aspects of the trance process, so that the posture is creating the same sorts of experiences that they want to have. Typically, the tobacco is creating the sorts of experiences that they want to have. Typically, you take the posture and the tobacco, you put them together, and those are going to be reinforcing the experiences that each one would be creating independent of each other. And then you add into that this cultural preference, this cultural desire, this cultural emphasis on having these sorts of relationships. And man, you're going to have a very powerful experience that's going to include soul flight, flying to a different world, interacting with powerful spiritual entities to get questions answered, which is exactly what the Casas Grandes people were seeking to have as part of their shamanic tradition. So the upshot here is that in the same way that the Yanomamo or the Lakota or any other group were tying together their experiences using various sorts of entheogens and various sorts of contexts and culture and all that stuff to produce certain sorts of impacts, certain sorts of experiences, so are the Casas Grandes people. And a significant part of this is, in fact, the posture. They aren't just simply adopting this posture just because. Rather, they have this posture because it corresponds specifically to certain sorts of experiences that they desire to have, that is reinforced with the use of tobacco and their cultural preferences, that actually leads to a very consistent sort of an experience. Now, as part of this, because we see this also over in the Mississippian period, which is contemporaneous but independent of the Casas Grandes culture, and because we see this in Mesoamerica, what we think we actually have here is a ceremonial complex that started in Mesoamerica and probably spread with agriculture, with the spread of maize up into the southeast and the southwest, such that we actually have a sort of a pan-New World cultural system here that includes this particular posture as part of the larger ritual tradition.
Then the feather serpent, I'm just going to add to that symbolically, the feather serpent in northern Mexico is said to actually get his snout underneath the maize crops and push up the corn up through it. And so it makes sense from this Grandes area, what we know ethnographically with the groups, with the feather serpent is really important for maize propagation. So if this comes in with that, this symbolic system makes a lot of sense from the Casas area based on modern people as well.
I want to also point out that there's a tobacco association with the Tennessee diviner and the culture from which he comes, the Mississippian. You can speak more about that, Chris, but Goodman would always tell us to make the offering with a little tobacco for this particular artifact that we're using, this particular posture that we're using. Traditionally, we've just always done that because she said to. We didn't know why. We hadn't put all that together until you informed us about the deep ritual with tobacco. So,
and it's for cleansing and for it's spiritual cleansing. It's typically, and then again, it's also used to keep your crops clean. And they'll do a lot of planting with tobacco around the crops to keep the pesticides away from them. But also tobacco smoke is a really good pesticide. It can clean the body of bugs as well. And so a lot of people have proposed, anthropologists like David Whitley, that as a spirit plant, it kills the actual physical bugs, but also can kill spirit bugs. And it makes a very powerful plant at all kinds of levels, from the physical to the stuff we can't really see. And that other reality is working in there too.
Boy, that makes a lot of sense. So Paul would always get a little container of native tobacco, very pure tobacco, to use as the offering.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Wow.
So that's our research in a very quick nutshell. But we do have a copy of this paper. If you're interested in getting a copy of the paper, we're on the final tail end of kind of getting it all put together. But please email me at VanPool, VANPOOLT at Missouri.edu. And I'll gladly send a copy of the paper to anybody who would like to have a copy of the paper.
Perfect.
Could you tell us what you think of the implications of posture in this? Goodman's revelation
Before we
for
go-
her was, hey, it was sitting there all along. It was like the purloined envelope, she would say. It's there, but nobody recognized it as such. And would you say that that is true for this work? Like, here's posture associated with these figures, these effigies, that's associated with tobacco, with all of this cosmology. It's right there in front of our eyes, but it takes a bit of a moment of aware, like, what am I trying to
Absolutely.
say?
I think
Yeah,
that's,
could you describe
I think
that?
that's exactly right, because I think this is one of those unknown unknowns. I
Yeah.
think that we just simply assume that people used entheogens and people had culture and they would have these experiences. But when you read the ethnographic records, people talk about shamans going into trance, but they don't really talk about the positions shamans were going into trance, except for some unusual cases. But then when you look at the images, a lot of times it'll be like, oh, hey, these folks are actually in the same position when they're going into trance, or you can see how important the trance movement was. Now, sometimes ethnographers actually did catch it on this, and they did talk about it some. But it's one of those things that where I don't think we have properly understood how important some of these positions are actually in terms of being able to have the right sort of experience. And I think that it's not a mistake that the Casas Grandes people happen to have used the exact same position that Goodman identified as having the right sort of experiences for exactly the sort of experiences we see the Casas Grandes people having. That's just simply asking for, that's too many coincidences all at once. It's parsimony would suggest that the fact that Goodman found that this particular posture corresponds to these sorts of experiences, which are exactly the sorts of experiences that the Casas Grandes people are recording in their pottery and were obviously valuing as part of their shamanic tradition.
This
Yes.
was my surprise.
That suggests that these are, intelligent people who knew that you could do different things in this world, but they chose to do.
And then why not
Seems to be the
add
same.
more bells and whistles? Because it's effective. It deepens the experience. It focuses the experience greatly. Do you want to show? We sent you the Olmec Tennessee diviner
I can open them up.
posture and the artifact and the Egyptian. It's just interesting to see
Yeah. So
that
I don't
these
have
are
those
even further
ready to
spread
go.
in time
Yeah,
and
Paul, if you want to-
geography.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll stop sharing.
Oh, well, just for a moment, I'm going to get back to the implications here and take comments and questions. Yeah.
The statistical way that you
second,
make
where
it.
is it? Right there.
Okay.
Pull this down.
That will look here.
So there, we were surprised to find this in Egypt. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's
The hand is pulled back a little more than on the knee, but still so similar. And this has wearing a cat's head. And so look at this.
but the
from
same knee
Olmec.
is upright with the hand over the front of the knee.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is Olmec. So there's a couple.
And also the Olmec is wearing that particular mouth position of the were jaguar or the were toad. And here, that's a very significant shamanic
And
indicator as
most of
well.
my colleagues talk about that being associated with shamanism and transformation. That's just shamanic sensibility, the were jaguars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. Also, you mentioned the feathered serpent, and I would say that we find it in Europe. This particular posture, the feathered serpent looks like this, and we find it, yes, in Mesoamerica, but also Old Europe, Neolithic Europe, with a bird's beak on the face, and then chevrons, which are, in my mind, associated with serpents or snakes. And Jose Bolio, we got to meet him in our tour.
We did, yeah.
The
We've got all of
Mayan
his books.
pyramids.
Yeah.
And he would say, in his mind, the chevrons and those geometric symbols are right from the rattlesnake. I don't know if you find rattlesnakes in Europe, but
Yeah.
the chevrons are interesting to have an artifact covered with that, with a bird's feathered serpent, right? And that is from the earth to the heavens, right? That association, bridging that communication.
Yeah.
So interesting, the symbology. One of my favorites, you talked about the Coast Salish people of the Pacific Northwest. One of my favorites shows a bird atop the headdress. And this particular one always sends us right into the upper world, into that soul flight.
We see that
So,
many times with
yeah.
the representation of feathers or birds without showing in the artifact, and then people have that experience of sky, of heavens, of
I mean, we find those correlations over and over. So I just
So-
want to say we are so thrilled to work with you both, to work with the anthropology, the cultural, the cognitive, the breadth and the depth, the shamanic work that you do, the fact that one of you abstains from practicing this to remain that neutral party, and the other dives right in, as Goodman herself did.
Right.
And so I just want to say how important to this institute your work is, collaborating with you, and how this is so worthy of the academic look. I can't wait to look at folklore and mythology and so many other aspects, neurology. So there's so much to go exploring with this.
I just wanted to mention also, of course, is that this has been an ongoing debate within the anthropological community, but it's adjusted and changed. People like Edith and Victor Turner and their research, and there was the criticism of them participating in the rituals and being a part of the ceremonies. But the world
Well,
has
look at
switched.
Harner. Look what he did.
Yeah, and
right?
the world has
The other
switched and
gentleman.
flipped. And so there's still going to be those who abstain, who feel like it's the wrong direction to take the work. But you can only stand back so far with a notebook and pen before you really know what you're talking about. You got to get into the experience and know what you're talking about. So I truly appreciate Christine diving deep and being open. And also being critical, being open to the fact if it's not working, it's not working. And if it is working, I'm going to document it, both ways.
And I appreciate you, Todd, in your position as well,
Yeah.
because I think that's an important. Do you want to speak to that, the both of you?
One of the things I think that is very interesting here is that with the different positions, we're not going to be able to say, it's not going to be the sort of thing where it's like people who are in, say, the feathered serpent position always have an experience with feathered serpents, and people who are in other positions never have an experience with feathered serpents. Rather, this is going to be sort of a statistical framework where we're going to be able to look at the differences between the various postures. We're going to be able to identify and see within a larger assemblage sort of a framework how these are influencing the experiences that people have. And so you give me, I tell my students when I'm dealing with stone tools, you mentioned stone tools previously, you give me a flake and all I've got is a flake. You give me an assemblage and I can make it seen. I can tell you
multiple points of data that show a pattern.
Give me a bunch of stone artifacts and I can make them sing. They will sing us a great story. I think the same thing is present here. If you give me one experience that somebody has, I may not be able to tell you, oh, it's this posture, that posture. But if you give me a bunch of different sorts of reported experiences that people have, I think that we're going to be able to make those assemblages sing. We're going to be able to talk about how this particular posture corresponds to these sorts of experiences and how that differs between other postures. And we're going to be able to identify what the core experiences are that characterize postures. Not necessarily for everybody, not necessarily for every time, but as a statistical pattern.
And nor should they, because this is a very personal and sacred journey between you and whatever that is. And it's meant for you, right? It's instructive for you. And there's benefit and there's personal insight and there's meaning, deep, deep meaning, no matter what it is that you experience. But what we find is it's so interesting that so often the group dynamic also enters into this with some interesting insight or lesson or emotional shift or resolution. It's so interesting and so multi-layered.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, this takes us back to the very origins of this work in the first place. Felicitas created the hypothesis and did the experiments with her students. And now we've been doing this for almost 50 years and tens of thousands of students trying the practice. But still, I remain at the position that we're at the infancies of this work. We don't know where it's going to go and what its potential is. And the verification and the validation of going back to the original question of, does a posture impact the experience of trance versus just listening to drum or rattle without it? And we're convinced that it makes a difference. But at the same time, just because we are, that doesn't make it a scientific, a valid approach. It needs to have the analysis of someone like you two, to help us put it in the right context so that we can move further with the work rather than relying on a belief system. We feel like we have abundant evidence showing that this work is significantly effective in the way that it works, but we don't have the data to crunch to back it up. We haven't crunched the data to
Well,
back
actually,
it all
we do
up.
have a lot of data, but also
It hasn't been crunched, is my point.
Well, it is getting there now, but
In our heads, but not publicly.
and
Yeah.
this is the mission here. But I want to say that here, this institute's been existing for 50 years, 50
yeah,
years.
going on
But
50.
look at the shamanic cultures and the millennia
Mm-hmm.
of use and the knowledge base and the deepening of that. That's
Mm-hmm.
pretty much gone for most of Western society. We've lost that connection. There are some cultures and they have their methodologies, and those are beautiful. But I will say that Goodman gave us a universal formula for us Westerners to find our way back and not step on cultural toes. I think that's very significant.
That is important. Yeah.
And to have direct experience. Us today can have these direct experiences in a safe container for beneficial results across the board. And I think that's fascinating, but we still have so many pieces to fill in the puzzle because we don't have the ancient databases at the ready. We can't sit down with the ancient shamans and ask these questions or see what their exact protocols are or what they made of it. But all we know is that it infiltrated and supported their cosmology, their art, their culture. It was a form A, one of many basis for that. It was significant. And so I guess my questions for me is, what is the nature of reality that this is so? What is the nature of culture? What's our deep history that's been hidden from us? And what does that have to say? And how can it point us, right, to come home again and be in right relation
Right.
with ourselves and our culture and our world and where we're going? I mean, to me, that's the purpose for this. It's not just having a beautiful journey, that's beautiful, but it's the larger mission of what does it mean? What
Right.
is the deep meaning?
And
It's
I
back to
lo-
who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going?
I want to get back to
Sure.
Chris and Todd, but
Yes.
I just wanted to mention that, of course, you brought up a really important point. In this world of evolution, of being more sensitive, we know that there's a difference between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. So Goodman, from the very beginning, was very careful that we don't appropriate. We're not copying somebody's ritual. We're not copying someone's inner secret practices.
No, but we're reclaiming this
reclaiming-
as a birthright,
but as a birthright
for
of humanity,
ourselves.
because we're finding
Yeah.
the universality of it around the planet. But
Yeah.
we're not, people will come to the New Mexico Institute and ask us about Pueblo culture, and we'll say, we're not experts on Pueblo culture. In fact, we don't know their rituals. And in fact, we choose not to know because we don't want it to be something that we just unconsciously digest and put it into our ritual. We want that to be theirs. If they want to share something
We're very
with us and
respectful.
say, the respectful thing to do on this land when you greet the sun is to do this, we say, thank you for that gift, we'll do that. But we're not going to go to their thing and go home and use it without them giving us permission. So
I think you hit on a very important part there. So again, I'm not being critical of Harner, but Harner had a sort of a structure that he created that was shamanic at its core, and that was designed to be inspired by or to incorporate some things that he had encountered as an anthropologist. Goodman never even ties this to shamanism. So Goodman talks about trance experiences, but it's not shamanic trance necessarily. Now, people can have shamanic trance with it.
right, that's
That
true.
was
And
something
there's
different.
correlations between the two, but
Yeah.
not
Absolutely.
exact.
So
Yeah.
Goodman never said, here's how people in, say, the Upper Paleolithic did things. What Goodman said was that we can use the posture that we see depicted in Upper Paleolithic art. And in this context, it produces altered states of consciousness, which is very different. And so when you all are doing the Tennessee diviner posture, you're not trying to recreate what people did in the medieval period Casas culture. In fact, we know it was very different from what they did because they're ingesting tobacco and doing a whole bunch of stuff you all are not doing. So this is an independent framework compared to what we see worldwide. It's not, as you pointed out, it's not attempting to recreate what any one culture did or even what a whole bunch of cultures did. This is instead Goodman saying, hey, we can take these postures, we can create this situation, 15 minutes of the pounding of the drum or the rattle of the beat, and here's the results we can get, which is not the same thing as any culture anywhere in the world has ever done before. This is a brand new practice.
Wow.
Mhm.
Well said.
But utilizing that, weaving those same elements that they used in this way. And she was also very proud of the fact that this is really useful for us moderns who are time crunched. We want to dial up on demand. We have busy lives. We're doing our thing, but we can also include this. We can all knock on the door of this alternate reality and partake of its many benefits and enjoy and integrate that. Thank you. So how did you get us so clearly, Todd?
We're always quite proud to talk about the work and just say talking at the Paleolithic caves of Europe and going back to 30,000 years, and just so we can have that universality of the practice and not feel that something's been adopted from a Native American culture or Mesoamerican culture or whatever, or
But
shamanism itself from.
But if this has held
Siberia or
humankind
whatever, right.
from the get-go, right? If this has been part of us since the
Right.
Paleolithic at least,
Right.
and probably before that, then why not continue it forward?
Sure.
Isn't it our duty to continue this forward in a way that works?
Yeah.
That's true to its inherent benefits and beauty,
Somebody asked
but
me
in a new way.
in one interview of Dr. Goodman one time, they said, well, you keep talking about this, our ordinary reality, and you talk about this alternative reality, and what's the difference? What happens if you live life without this alternative life, this alternative experience? And she said, life becomes boring. And it's like, and this is the full expanse of the human experience is there to digest and enjoy. We don't have to cut it off at its knees and only enjoy half of the experience.
That's why the term ecstatic is so perfect
Helps,
for this. The sense of stepping outside your stasis, your norm, right, temporarily, but also
Okay.
it's joyful. We're all ecstasy deprived.
You
She didn't mean the drug,
yeah,
right?
no.
Just what your body produces.
So
Yeah.
you wound up the dial and now
Oh, dear.
Laura and I are off. But anyway, we appreciate this.
Let's take comments. Yeah.
Okay. But first of all, you didn't get a chance to let them comment.
Oh,
first.
yes, of
Yeah,
course.
After all I just
What do you
said.
think it all means? What would you hope to find
Yeah.
from further?
As an independent
analysis
researcher,
of this?
where would this go next?
What are the key questions for you and Chris that you're asking?
So I'm again deeply appreciative of what you're saying here, Laura. I tend to be so very practical that what I'm really attempting to get is better understand the archaeological record and understand how postures impact the way that people have these sorts of experiences. So my goal here is actually very utilitarian in the sense of I want to explain why it is that archaeology, or why it is that the archaeological record of the medieval period has these sorts of characteristics and how all of this ties together into a coherent cosmological framework.
Mhm.
That's what I like to get out of all of this stuff, and not just simply in the Casas region, but looking worldwide, because I think that Dr. Goodman was onto something, that these different postures do in fact correspond to different sorts of experiences, and that we can help in the same way that understanding that the Huichol were using peyote, that helps us understand Huichol cosmology, and the cosmology helps us understand why they're using peyote, and that all fits together into a better understanding of the Huichol. I think the same thing is true in the Casas region. I think the same thing is going to be true in the Southeast. And I think the same thing is going to be true in Egypt. And I'd like to get to where I can put together those sorts of anthropological frameworks.
And I know Chris has her own questions as well, which will
does.
be intriguing. But do we have time for any
Well,
questions,
no one
comments?
has their hands up, but the chat room obviously has been extremely active throughout this discussion from the very beginning,
Yeah.
and we'll be happy to go back through. But for today's presentation, I'd like
Can I
to
just have one more comparison?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I see Fred here, and he's asked the question before, is there a posture for gratitude? And I know that we've mentioned religion, we mentioned Christianity, and I was just seeing an article where they were talking about this posture that priests generally do. And we see this in the ancient art record, this posture, and we have been experimenting with this posture. And indeed, it, oh boy, does it invite so much tremendous energy and uplift and joy. And you are inviting, transmitting, receiving. So it's interesting how posture is in so many cultures that we use today, so many gestures that are well known and utilized today, but we don't recognize them as such, right? They're a body language, we utilize them, but we're not specifically seeing them as a physiological emphasis to jumpstart a particular experience, I guess you could say. right? They're under recognized. That's what I'm trying to say.
Wrap this together.
What would you like to say as your finale, both of you?
In conclusion, or kind of as a concluding thought, I think that the nature of human behavior, the nature of religious experiences is complex. And I think that trying to identify the various factors that influence it, that create these sorts of structures that we see universally, that we know are important to people, and that sometimes are the most important aspects of many parts of their behavior and many aspects of their interaction with the environment, interaction with other people. The work that you all have been doing, the work that Goodman has done, the work that other anthropologists have done, provided a lot of insight, but there's still a whole lot of questions to be asked and answered. I think that as we get better at understanding human cognition, human behavior, and the structures that are going along here with what Goodman doing, with what Goodman was doing, being an important part of that, I think that we're going to get some really profound insights. And so I kind of wish I had a time machine to jump 50 years into the future, because I think we're going to know a lot more than we know now. There's going to be some really interesting work, and I'm glad to be a part of that with you all and with your collaborators there at the Cuyamungue Institute.
Thank our entire community, because they've all been part of this research. Everybody that has shown up for our various Zoom experiential sessions, and everybody's invited. You can find out at CuyamungueInstitute.com. We've got the schedule. You just register, that you get an email. Here's the Zoom codes. Come on and join us. So very, very open invitation on that. But I want to thank the entire community and all the researchers through the entire journey with this, because it's all been the compilation of these multiple experiences that you've said provide the insight, the patterns, the assemblage, the keeping the work alive and vibrant and seeing where it can go. So we're particularly indebted to you both as well.
And you talk about jumping ahead 50 years, and I've already offered your son to be the director
Basil
of the institute.
and
so,
Roy in
Roy,
particular has
Roy,
shown
yeah,
interest.
Have Roy be the director, and you'll be able to be grandpa. And
There you go.
Make it a family
All right,
affair.
well, beautiful. Well, wonderful to have you both here. Christine, you've contributed so much over the last 3 or 4 years, especially, and we're so appreciative. And of course, Todd, you're a dynamo of intellect and information and knowledge, and the way that you've been able to consolidate it and still remain independent. And we appreciate that point of view so much. It's only the way to go. So,
one last question, Todd. When you look at this use of entheogens with postures, entheogens widely accepted, thoroughly documented, no questions about this associated with altered states and what it's doing. But when you add postures with the entheogen use, as you've done in the case of the Pakeme research, then what does that say about postures being accepted on their own right, which has been ignored up till now, other than the work of Goodman and what you're all doing now? What is that? Is that paving the way for recognition of postures? And where do you think it will go from there?
Yes, the answer is absolutely. I think that Goodman was onto something. I think that her insights were ignored or overlooked. Ignored's the wrong term. I think there's the part of the problem with academia is there's so much research that's coming out all the time that's easy for ideas to get lost. And it'd be great if you could just simply say, oh, something can be published and people will find their way to it if it's good. But unfortunately, I think there are some really great ideas that have languished just simply because they didn't get picked up. And there's an element of chance or networking or luck or something goes along with that. I think a lot of times we start off with small steps, and if we can control some part of the world, that's cool, and we can start building from there. But we also become so focused on that one small part of the world. We're like the drunk who is sitting there, it's night, there's a bright light going on, there's a street light, and he's over there on the ground, and guy comes out of the bar and says, what's going on? The drunk says, I'm looking for my keys. And the guy says, well, let me help you find your keys. Did you drop them somewhere around here? The drunk says, no, I dropped them over here, but I have the lights here. I can see here. And we're sort of that same way, in that what we can see tends to be what we focus on, even if it's not where the answers are, we can at least see it. Mm-hmm. I think that I don't think that we have any method for looking at posture, except for the sorts of work that you all are doing. But so it's the sort of thing where I think a lot of people would acknowledge that, yeah, we see that postures are important, and we see that, for example, transcendental meditation associated with certain postures, that probably has an effect. But then trying to gather the data to show that effect, or to try to understand how that's playing into the system, becomes very hard. What's fortunate about what Dr. Goodman did, what you all are doing, is you've created the data, a very large data set that is spanning, now 3 generations, really, when you look at it, 3 generations, where we can start to pull those things apart. And to try to create this independent would be a Herculean task. You'd have to put forward an entire career to try to gather the sort of data that you all have gathered. It's an incredible resource that you and Dr. Goodman and the others that you've collaborated with have put together. And I think there's going to be wide excitement about this sort of research when people actually begin to understand it. I think that the biggest trick is going to be in trying to explain it, or to put it out there in a way that they can understand. Because when you just simply say, hey, here's what's going to happen, I'm going to beat on a drum for 15 minutes and you're going to have a dream, people are going to, I don't see how that works. Whereas I think that if you can show people, provide the information that you all have done, that hopefully we're doing here, people will be able to accept that as a real phenomenon. But we just had a conversation with a psychologist, and he was frankly kind of skeptical, because it's like, he understands that if you give people a pill, that can impact them, but he's less convinced that the altered states of consciousness are real outside of that sort of a context. But it's like, listen, people all over the world are reporting this sort of thing. There's something going on here neurologically, physiologically. It's documented cross-culturally, but it's not the language they tend to speak. It's not the way that they tend to approach the world. And I think that there's going to be some initial resistance, and this may be part of the reason why Goodman's work was kind of forgotten. She was talking about some stuff that the researchers that would be most interested in were not quite yet ready to hear. They didn't know what to do with it. Right. And as a result, it got put to the side and forgotten as a result.
Well said.
Yeah, thank you. Well, again, open invitation. You can test drive this for yourself.
Yeah.
We make it very easy and open. I mean, really, it's about direct experience. So not only do you hear the direct experience of others, and you can see that consistently over time, have it yourself. And that's the best proof of all, isn't it?
That's the best laboratory of all, is that we can at least be able to crunch and understand the data that's come from all of this direct experience, even though it falls into the category of subjective, as Todd has educated me on, is that subjective experience can be crunched as data that can be used in a scientific study. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to continue looking at the data,
at this, asking the questions, pushing this forward.
We never have total answers, but yeah. Well, thank you both again. It's been a wonderful conversation, and we'll look forward to the next.
And you've offered your email and for follow-up.
Sure.
So do you want to give that again, and then we'll...
Sure. VanPool, VanPool for Todd. So VanPoolT@Missouri.edu.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Crazy answer. I'm VanPool C for Christine @Missouri.edu. And so just in case somebody wants a different perspective.
Absolutely.
We appreciate the two together. Right.
Same here.
Oh, and the tobacco interview with Flavio and Laura and Lori.
If you go to Cuyamungue Institute.com, and there's a search box, you put the name Flavio, Flavio, it will bring you right to that podcast. Great discussion.
Yeah.
All right. Blessings. Thank you all for joining us today.
Take care.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.